It was the day of the succession ritual, the ceremony that would determine the next heir to the throne through a magic aptitude test. As the seventh prince, Ryan already knew where he stood. In the Empire, hair color wasn't just a matter of appearance, it was a symbol of magical talent. The brighter a person's hair, the greater the magic power they possessed, and those blessed with such power were considered true royalty. Ryan, however, had been born with black hair. In the eyes of the imperial family, that made him no different from a crow. During the ceremony, each prince sat according to rank while waiting for the ritual to begin. Even among all his children, there was one undeniable truth. Their father, the emperor, was the strongest of them all. As the first prince stepped forward to begin the test, according to his memories, this was exactly how things were supposed to happen. But it didn't go as planned. Everything had started in an office during his previous life. A so-called high-level businessman had approached him with a money-doubling scheme, claiming they only wanted to help. At the time, he had been desperate. Even after his father passed away, he still had to work tirelessly just to survive. He knew something felt off, but there wasn't much a broke guy like him could do. In the end, he took the bait. His money vanished faster than a crypto rug pull. 2 years later, his life had completely fallen apart. He could barely keep himself together. Sometimes, even after buying snacks for a meal, he ended up throwing them back up. As an ordinary 28-year-old man living in South Korea, his life was anything but normal. Every miserable day traced back to the scammer who had run away with his money, leaving him buried under a mountain of debt. After finishing a 5-hour shift at his part-time job one evening, he returned home and picked up his favorite novel, Dark Heather. No matter how many times he read it, opening that book always made him feel a little better. It was his escape from reality, the one place where he could forget his problems for a while. As he read, something outside the window caught his attention. A black crow feather drifted through the air, then blood suddenly poured from his nose and mouth, splattering across the pages of the book. His heart stopped beating. He couldn't breathe. At the very same moment, the book began radiating a strange dark energy, and just like that, his already shitty life came to an abrupt end. The next time he opened his eyes, he was somewhere completely different. At first, he assumed he was dreaming, but the room surrounding him was far too luxurious to belong to someone like him. When he glanced out the window, he spotted dozens of crows perched on a nearby tree. One of them stared directly at him before letting out a loud call. Thinking it was still some bizarre dream, he tried to calm himself down. Then the crow suddenly started acting friendly, which only made the situation even weirder. As he approached the window, he froze on the spot. 3 moons hung high in the night sky. Beneath them stretched a massive city that looked strangely familiar. The moment he caught sight of his reflection, the truth slammed into him like a truck. He had become Ryan Aberon, the 7th prince of the Aberon Empire. Just then, a maid named Anna called from outside his room. Startled, he hurriedly tried to stop her from entering, only to lose his balance and crash onto the floor. Somehow, Anna immediately seemed to understand what had happened. She quickly apologized and said she would come back later. After hearing her voice and taking in his surroundings once more, there was no longer any room for doubt. This world was the setting of novel Dark Heather. Unfortunately, there was one massive problem. Out of every character he could have possessed, he had become Ryan Aberon. Unlike the powerful princes who dominated the story, Ryan was a doomed character destined to suffer a miserable death early in the novel. Left alone in the room, he could only curse his unbelievably terrible luck. Just then, a butler named Sign arrived, his dark glasses giving him an even more intimidating presence. The moment Ryan heard the name, recognition clicked instantly. Entering the room, the butler calmly explained that he had personally accompanied the maid to deliver the prince's dinner. After adjusting his glasses, he politely asked whether the prince's health had improved. Not wanting to die on his very first day in this world, Ryan forced himself to stay composed. Putting on a polite smile, he claimed that he was feeling much better. Seemingly satisfied with the answer, Sign gave a small nod and immediately instructed the maid to prepare the table. As the meal was being set up, Ryan quickly noticed 2 things. First, the maid was trembling so badly that she looked as though she might collapse at any moment. Second, the food itself looked more suitable for a stray dog than a prince. Wanting to make things easier for her, he reached for the teapot to pour his own tea. Unfortunately, his hand accidentally brushed against the maid's. The teapot tilted, and scalding tea spilled across the table. The maid's face instantly lost all color. Dropping to her knees, she desperately begged for mercy while staring at the spreading puddle. Completely baffled, Ryan watched her frantically try to clean the mess as though her life depended on it. In her mind, she seemed convinced that she was about to be executed. Only then did he remember the reputation of this body's original owner. Prince Ryan had been a cruel and sadistic tyrant who punished servants for the smallest mistakes and had even ordered executions over completely trivial matters. Trying to ignore the awkward situation, Ryan sat down and prepared to eat. Unfortunately, another interruption arrived almost immediately. Wearing a cynical expression, Sign stepped forward carrying a document. Without offering any explanation, he casually dropped it onto the prince's table and stated that an urgent signature was required. Picking up the quill, Ryan examined the papers, wondering what kind of ridiculous business a fool like the original Ryan could possibly be involved in. It only took a brief glance to uncover the truth. The documents were little more than a scheme designed to siphon money from the estate's budget. Sign could act this boldly because of his connections to the Empress. Since the original Ryan was notoriously foolish, the reincarnated prince briefly considered whether he should simply sign the papers to keep events moving along the same path as the novel. Sign, meanwhile, smirked and mockingly asked whether his master had forgotten how to write his own name. Irritated by the blatant disrespect, Ryan silently cursed his fate for ending up in the body of such a pathetic prince. Then it happened again. Just like the scammer from his previous life, Sign repeated the exact same manipulative tactic. There was no need to think, he implied. All the prince had to do was sign. The words immediately dragged Ryan back to the worst memory of his life. He could practically see the smiling face of the scammer who had ruined him. It was the same attitude, the same pressure, and the same promise that everything would work out if he simply signed his name. His jaw tightened. The situation felt almost identical to the one that had destroyed his life. The only difference was that this time he saw it coming. He swore that he would never allow himself to be fooled again. Without hesitation, he questioned the numbers listed in the report and calmly pointed out the obvious embezzlement. For the first time, Sign looked genuinely surprised. A strange smile crossed the assistant's face as he remarked that he had underestimated the prince's intelligence. Even so, he quickly attempted to change the subject and casually suggested that the prince should sign before the food became cold. Before Sign could finish speaking, a pitcher suddenly flew across the table. The maid instantly flinched and curled into herself in terror. A loud crash echoed through the room as the pitcher shattered at the assistant's feet. Water splashed across his clothing while broken fragments scattered across the floor. Sign stared at the wreckage in complete confusion. Ryan, meanwhile, remained perfectly calm and casually explained that his hand had slipped. The truth was that Sign's supposed connection to the Empress was nowhere near as impressive as he pretended. In reality, the Empress didn't even know he existed. Leaning comfortably into his chair, Ryan acted as though nothing unusual had happened. Sane, however, could hardly comprehend the dramatic change in the prince's behavior. Determined to change his destiny, Ryan calmly blamed the accident on the assistant's distraction and stated that he should take responsibility for the mess. He had no intention of remaining a powerless victim. Armed with his knowledge of the novel, he planned to survive and eventually seize control of his own fate. Sign hesitated as cold sweat slowly formed on his forehead. Then, with a simple gesture, Ryan pointed toward the water soaking into the expensive carpet and ordered the man to clean it up. Within the empire, members of the royal family were treated as beings beyond question. Their golden hair and overwhelming magical abilities made them appear almost perfect in the eyes of the people. Ryan Aberin, however, was the one exception. Unlike the rest of the imperial bloodline, he possessed ordinary black hair and carried the reputation of a complete fool. Throughout the empire, he was known as the disgrace of the royal family. Sign knew that reputation better than anyone. In fact, he still remembered all the bribes he had paid in an attempt to avoid being assigned to serve such a prince. Unfortunately for him, even money couldn't overcome a direct royal order. No matter how much resentment he felt, the authority of the imperial family was absolute. Swallowing his pride, he reluctantly knelt beside the maid and began cleaning the spilled tea from the floor. After finishing the task, Sign stood up and announced that the carpet had been cleaned. Unfortunately for him, Ryan wasn't finished. The very next moment, another teacup flew through the air and shattered right in front of him. Ryan calmly observed the new mess before remarking that Sign's cleaning skills still seemed to need improvement. A dangerous red gleam flashed through the prince's eyes as he ordered the man to clean everything again, this time faster than before. The command immediately pushed Sign closer to his limit. Growing increasingly desperate, he attempted to invoke the Empress's name as a final threat, hoping it would force the prince to back down. Unfortunately for him, Ryan knew exactly what kind of bluff it was. The assistant's supposed connection to the Empress wasn't nearly as significant as he pretended. Deciding it was time to completely crush the man's arrogance, Ryan shifted his attention toward the trembling maid. Pointing directly at her, he ordered her to cover her ears tightly. Then, in a cold and chilling voice, he warned that if she heard even a single word of what was about to be said, he would personally remove her fingers. The threat was enough to terrify her completely. The maid pressed both hands firmly against her ears. Then Ryan turned back toward Sign and spoke several dark and mysterious words. Whatever he said was enough to completely shatter the assistant's composure. With every sentence, Sign's expression changed dramatically. The anger disappeared first, then his confidence vanished. Before long, only pure terror remained. His face turned deathly pale, and sweat poured down his body as though he had just witnessed something truly horrifying. Several days later, rumors about the prince's sudden transformation had spread throughout the castle. Groups of maids gathered in the courtyard and exchanged stories while carrying out their duties. During one such conversation, Anna remarked that the atmosphere within the mansion had become noticeably heavier and far more intimidating than before. Despite that, most of them agreed on one thing: they were relieved. Ever since that day, the prince had spent most of his time locked inside his room and rarely interacted with anyone. As the conversation continued, one of the maids casually reminded Anna that she was supposed to be handling cleaning duties. The young maid immediately stiffened at the reminder. Meanwhile, Far away from the gossip and rumors, the castle library remained peaceful. Sitting comfortably with a cup of tea in hand, Ryan quietly celebrated the success of his intimidation tactics. Nobody bothered him anymore. Even the troublesome butler had completely disappeared from sight after narrowly avoiding having another dish thrown at him. As he carefully considered his future, the former self remembered that he still had 3 years before the point in the story when Prince Ryan was destined to die. Having read Dark Heather countless times in his previous life, he possessed knowledge of future events that nobody else in the world could possibly know. With such an enormous advantage in hand, he came to a simple conclusion. Until the true protagonist finally entered the stage, he intended to enjoy every luxury royal life had to offer. Sitting by the window, Ryan gazed up at the beautiful blue sky stretching endlessly above the castle. As he watched the clouds drift by, a casual thought crossed his mind. It would be pretty amazing to fly freely through the sky like a bird. Suddenly, a wave of pain struck without warning, so intense that it instantly filled him with dread. Every nerve seemed to scream at once. The luxurious teacup slipped from his hand and crashed onto the stone floor, shattering into pieces. Ryan collapsed alongside it, writhing in agony as an unbearable burning sensation spread throughout his body. The pain was overwhelming, far worse than anything he had ever experienced in either of his lives. Gritting his teeth, he desperately tried to endure it, but the suffering only continued to intensify. At that very moment, Anna knocked on the door and politely asked for permission to enter and clean the room. Meanwhile, Ryan could do nothing but silently beg for help. After receiving no response, the maid cautiously opened the door and stepped inside. Not seeing the prince anywhere in the large room, she immediately let out a sigh of relief. At least she wouldn't have to face him today. However, after taking a few steps forward, she noticed the shattered remains of the expensive teacup scattered across the office floor. As she carefully collected the luxurious porcelain fragments, she couldn't help mourning the waste. In her mind, something that valuable could have fed her humble family for months. Then a strange rustling sound echoed from behind a piece of furniture. The unexpected noise instantly caught her attention. To her surprise, a small crow with glowing red eyes suddenly emerged from the corner of the room. The bird stared directly at her in an unusually strange way before awkwardly hopping across the stone floor in her direction. Anna watched the bizarre behavior with confusion. Feeling sorry for the little creature, she gently picked it up and cradled it in her arms. She then warned the bird that it needed to leave immediately because a very cruel man lived there. Hearing those words, the crow was completely stunned. At that moment, Ryan finally realized the horrifying truth. Somehow, during that unbearable pain, he had transformed from Prince Ryan into a crow. His mind raced as he desperately tried to make sense of the situation. A moment later, Anna opened the window. She warned the bird that if the prince caught them together, both of them would be eliminated. Ryan immediately tried to scream that he was the prince, but only silent protests came out. Ignoring the crow's obvious panic, Anna carefully held him up before tossing him out through the open window. The moment he left her hands, pure terror exploded inside his mind. He was falling fast. The castle stood at a massive and incredibly dangerous height, and the ground below was rushing toward him at an alarming speed. Ryan went into full panic mode, convinced he was moments away from being crushed into a smear on the ground. Inside his head, he screamed desperately, while frantically searching for a way to survive. As the terrifying free fall continued, Ryan realized there was only one option left. If he wanted to live, he needed to learn how to use his new wings immediately. Panic completely overtook his thoughts as he forced himself to flap them with everything he had. Again and again, he pushed himself, determined to avoid a horrible death. Then, at the very last second, it happened. His body stabilized, the rapid descent slowed, and suddenly he was no longer falling. Instead, he was floating in the air. Ryan stared in disbelief as he began gliding smoothly through the wind. Even after surviving the ordeal, he could hardly believe what had happened. Somehow, against all odds, he had actually learned how to fly. But that relief didn't last long. Now that he had become a crow, would he ever be able to return to his human form? Hours later, night settled over the palace, and the 3 colorful moons glowed brightly through the dark, cloud-covered sky. Thankfully, Ryan had managed to transform back into a human safely. To make sure it wasn't a one-time fluke, he repeated the transformation several more times. Each attempt confirmed the same unbelievable truth. He could now turn into a crow whenever he wanted, through sheer willpower alone. The discovery left him stunned. As he tried tracing the source of this bizarre ability, he quickly realized something even stranger. This power had never existed in the novel's original story. Whatever was happening here was completely outside the plot he knew. Because of that, Ryan understood one thing very clearly: this secret had to stay buried. Revealing an unknown power could throw the entire timeline into chaos and completely destroy his plans for survival. A knock soon came from his bedroom door. A servant informed him that the nightly ritual would begin shortly and that he needed to prepare immediately. Hearing those words, Ryan's expression turned serious. The long-awaited day had finally arrived. What appeared to be a simple monthly royal gathering was actually a succession test, one where the 7th prince was usually ignored like he didn't even exist. After entering the enormous hall, hall. Ryan took his seat at the very end of the massive table. Seeing the palace's luxury up close felt completely different from reading about it. Around him, his blonde-haired brothers whispered among themselves with obvious disdain. Before long, a prince from the opposite side of the table loudly mocked him, demanding to know how an idiot like Ryan dared to raise his head so shamelessly. The speaker was Salos Aberon, the 8th prince and Ryan's younger half-brother, a guy who openly despised him and showed zero respect. When nobody paid attention to his outburst, Salos angrily slammed his hand against the table. Ironically, neither of them realized they were both insignificant secondary villains in the grand story of the novel. Before things could escalate, the first princess calmly placed a hand on Salos's shoulder and scolded him. The effect was immediate. The arrogant prince instantly fell silent and apologized in fear. As Ryan observed the hall, he noticed that every important prince was seated according to rank. He remembered one of the world's basic rules: the brighter a noble's hair, the greater their magical power, known as Manus. The previous owner of Ryan's body had possessed black hair and no magical ability whatsoever, making him the only prince without Manus. That fact explained a lot about the bitterness and twisted personality the original 7th prince had developed. Then heavy footsteps echoed throughout the hall. The room instantly fell silent as the most feared and powerful man in the empire made his entrance. An imposing figure with long, shining white hair walked toward the center of the banquet hall with overwhelming authority. Every noble present lowered their head before the emperor, a legendary ruler who governed the nation with an absolute iron fist. Without wasting a second, the emperor ordered the test to begin. He stepped toward an ancient blue stone slab and explained that the sacred relic measured the magical power of anyone who touched it. The moment his hand landed on the relic, a violent surge of blue energy exploded outward. A massive beam of light shot across the hall, instantly demonstrating the terrifying amount of power he possessed. The released energy spread across nearly the entire table, leaving the princes stunned by the sheer difference between themselves and the emperor. After displaying his strength, the ruler called for any heir who wished to measure their power to step forward. Remaining silent at the end of the table, Ryan watched carefully as the testing began. Soon, one of the older princes confidently volunteered to go first. Ryan remembered that under normal circumstances, only the first prince participated in this ritual because the rankings rarely changed. Every year, the crown prince used this ceremony as a public display of dominance, reminding every noble exactly who stood at the top of the royal hierarchy and who was destined to become the next emperor. But this time, something went horribly wrong. In the middle of his grand display, the first prince suddenly groaned in pain. His face twisted, and his body began showing signs of severe distress. One of his brothers immediately jumped from his seat and shouted in panic. Moments later, the crown prince violently coughed up fluid, throwing the entire hall into chaos. Servants rushed around frantically. Nobles screamed for doctors. Panic spread through the banquet hall like wildfire. Yet amidst all that confusion, Ryan remained the only person who understood exactly what was happening. According to the novel's original plot, this was the moment the first prince was supposed to die. His body would suffer catastrophic internal damage, leading to his tragic early death, and that single event would officially mark the beginning of the mysterious and deadly story our boy had been thrown into. Ryan remembered that magical abilities only appeared within the royal bloodline, but every royal possessed a completely unique power. The first prince wielded water magic, while the second prince had mastered fire. What bothered Ryan was that none of what he had just witnessed should have happened. According to the original story, the first prince's power measurement was only supposed to cover a little over half of the massive stone table. More importantly, there were still 6 whole months left before the disaster that should have crippled him. Yet somehow, that event had been pushed forward without warning. The timeline had changed. That realization sent a chill through Ryan. His own situation made even less sense. The 7th prince was never supposed to have any magic at all, yet immediately after Ryan took over the body, he gained the ability to transform into a crow. A completely new power appearing at the exact same time as his possession felt far too suspicious to be dismissed as coincidence. Meanwhile, inside his private chambers, the first prince was completely losing control. Furious and desperate, he smashed anything within reach, venting the frustration building inside him. Several objects were destroyed before he finally punched his bedroom mirror, shattering it into pieces. Unable to accept what had happened, he desperately attempted to use his water magic again, hoping to prove that his strength was still there. Instead, the moment he activated his power, unbearable agony tore through his body. He collapsed to his knees, coughing violently as intense pain burned through him. Horror quickly replaced anger as he realized the terrifying truth. Every attempt to use magic only made the pain worse. For the first time, he feared that he might never be able to wield his power again. Even so, he stubbornly refused to accept reality. Staggering to his feet, he kept reminding himself that he was the first prince, the legitimate heir to the empire, far superior to every other prince. In his mind, this had to be nothing more than a temporary setback. While trying to calm himself with a smoke, a mysterious voice suddenly emerged from the darkness, warning him to put it down if he wanted to survive. Startled, the The prince immediately spun around and demanded to know who dared enter his room uninvited. The figure calmly stepped out of the shadows. When questioned about how he had gotten inside, he casually replied that he had simply climbed the outer wall. The answer sounded ridiculous, but the intruder coldly remarked that whether the prince believed him or not made little difference. The visitor then asked how he was feeling, fully aware that the palace doctors had likely lied and claimed he was perfectly healthy. The first prince responded with a sarcastic laugh, attempting to hide his growing fear. Moments later, that laugh turned into loud, almost hysterical laughter as he desperately tried to appear intimidating before his younger brother. Ryan, however, remained completely calm, watching the performance without the slightest reaction. Frustrated by that indifference, the prince accused Ryan of poisoning him and intentionally planning to use the antidote later as leverage. Consumed by anger, he lunged forward with an outstretched hand, shouting that Ryan's scheme had failed. But before he could reach him, Ryan's next words stopped him cold. He calmly warned that within a week, the prince would be begging for death while suffering unimaginable torment. The first prince froze instantly. Sweat formed across his face as dread replaced his rage. Taking a seat on the couch as if discussing the weather, Ryan explained that he had not poisoned him and had no hidden plot against him. He revealed that the prince's body would continue breaking down until it eventually destroyed him, and admitted that even he didn't yet know who the true culprit was. Looking directly at him, Ryan stressed that listening carefully was absolutely crucial. Then he delivered the final blow, making it crystal clear that this conversation represented the prince's last opportunity to save his own life. Afterward, Ryan transformed back into a crow and flew away into the night. As he soared through the skies, he couldn't help feeling relieved. His older brother was every bit as cowardly and gullible as he had been in the original novel. That made him easy to manipulate and potentially useful for Ryan's future survival plans. The more he used his transformation ability, the more he appreciated how practical it was. Traveling across the empire had become incredibly convenient. Since he was already outside his quarters, Ryan decided he might as well handle a few additional matters before returning. Heavy rain soon began pouring over the imperial capital, but the small crow continued flying swiftly through the dark sky without slowing down. By the following morning, sunlight once again illuminated the palace grounds. Outside Ryan's room, Maid Anna stood nervously in front of the door. The prince hadn't eaten a single thing for 2 days, and her imagination was running wild. Terrified that something terrible might have happened to him, she feared the palace guards would punish her severely if he were harmed. Eventually, her anxiety overwhelmed her. Trembling with fear, she began knocking loudly on the door while repeatedly calling for the prince. Suddenly, the door swung open. Ryan appeared without warning and asked what all the noise was about. The shock caused Anna to lose her balance completely. She fell face first onto the hallway floor, sending the entire food tray flying from her hands. Dishes shattered across the luxurious carpet as food spilled everywhere. To make matters worse, the mess splattered directly onto Ryan's black shoes. The maid's face immediately turned pale with terror. Ryan simply stared at her with a completely blank expression, making the situation feel even more suffocating. Convinced her life was over, Anna dropped to her knees and desperately begged for mercy. Through tears, she explained that she had only wanted to help him stay healthy. She trembled while remembering all the horrifying rumors surrounding the violent seventh prince, and even pleaded for her family's safety. What she didn't know was that Ryan was merely trying to maintain the image of his cruel character. To her complete surprise, he didn't punish her at all. Instead, he gruffly ordered her to clean everything up within 5 minutes and disappear from his sight. He then coldly warned her never to enter his room again unless summoned, simply wanting to avoid more pointless interruptions in his daily routine. A full month had passed since the shocking incident during the sacred ritual, where the first prince suddenly became ill and suffered severe damage while measuring his power. Since then, a dangerous rumor had quietly spread throughout the palace. People were whispering that the crown prince had completely lost his magic. For the princes and princesses secretly eyeing the throne, that rumor was a golden opportunity. If the heir to the empire had truly become powerless, the balance of power would change overnight. Determined to crush those rumors before they spiraled further, the first prince personally begged the emperor to move up the empire's highly anticipated hunting competition. Ryan felt relieved when he heard the news because, despite the timeline changes, events were finally starting to follow the original novel again. Even so, he couldn't help worrying about how all these alterations might affect the true protagonist of the story. When the day of the grand hunting competition finally arrived, Ryan hoped he might get lucky enough to encounter the novel's actual main character. His thoughts were interrupted when an irritating voice loudly called him a bug in front of the crowd. One of his arrogant brothers had decided to mock him again, this time making fun of Ryan's black horse. Ryan silently observed that the prince seemed far more impulsive than he had been in the original novel, but he had no intention of wasting time on pointless arguments. Ignoring the taunts completely, he focused on the reason he had come. In truth, he actually liked his black horse, and had realized that the seventh prince possessed a surprisingly natural talent for taming animals. After riding beneath the open sky for some time, Ryan and the gathered nobles finally reached the competition grounds. Before them stood the entrance to the enormous imperial forest, a vast and mysterious woodland filled with magic. In the distance, Ryan spotted the Tower of Beginnings, the sacred location where the annual opening ritual was always held. He knew the hunting competition would officially begin the moment the first prince completed the traditional ceremony. However, everyone present understood that this event was far more than a simple hunt. It was a ruthless battlefield of royal politics where heirs competed for influence, prestige, and power. The emperor soon turned toward the first prince and coldly ordered him to begin the ritual without delay. One of the princes immediately made a fake comment about how healthy the crown prince appeared and provocatively asked what wish he planned to request from the emperor after winning. The remark referred to the special privilege awarded to the competition's victor, the right to make a direct request to the emperor himself. Acting completely confident, the first prince claimed victory before the event had even begun. Under countless watchful eyes, he started climbing the tower's stairs. As he ascended, whispers spread through the gathered nobles. Many openly discussed the rumors that he had lost his magic. Despite maintaining a composed appearance, the crown prince was extremely tense. While approaching the sacred relic, he silently prayed that Ryan's advice wasn't some elaborate scam. Among the anxious crowd below, Ryan simply watched with a faint smirk, completely confident in what was about to happen. Meanwhile, the crown prince swore to himself that if Ryan had deceived him, he would make his younger brother suffer the most painful death imaginable. Seeing how nervous and stiff Rasha looked, Ryan merely hoped he wouldn't lose his composure. After all, if the prince had followed his instructions exactly, something spectacular was about to unfold. The instant Rasha touched the sacred relic, an enormous torrent of glowing blue magic erupted into the sky. The explosion of energy was so massive that it burst through the tower and spread across the entire area. A gigantic whirlpool of magical power expanded wildly overhead, terrifying everyone present. The released energy became so violent that it generated a literal hurricane of magic. Powerful winds swept through the grounds, throwing guards and nobles backward as panic erupted. One guard shouted for everyone to retreat immediately, but Ryan remained perfectly calm, watching the chaos unfold. Rasha, however, refused to yield. Reminding himself that he was the first prince of the empire, he endured the crushing pressure and stubbornly held his ground. Through gritted teeth, he shouted his own name before releasing even more power. Then, at the top of his lungs, he declared that he alone was destined to become emperor. In response, a colossal blue dragon formed in the sky from the overwhelming amount of magical energy. The gigantic whirlpool descended from the heavens with terrifying force, illuminating the dark sky in brilliant blue light. The entire army gathered below was left speechless. Soldiers, nobles, and commoners alike stood frozen after witnessing such absurd power. Even the Duke watched with genuine admiration, acknowledging that this was the true might of the royal bloodline. Moments later, the crowd erupted into cheers, shouting praises for the first prince and celebrating the incredible display they had just witnessed. Ryan couldn't help remembering an earlier conversation with Rasha. Back then, he had handed the crown prince a strange dark stone. Rasha had immediately assumed he was being mocked, but Ryan calmly explained that the stone could absorb polluted magical power. He also bluntly stated that if Rasha wanted to die, he was free to ignore it. Hearing that Ryan had no intention of saving him against his own will only made the prince even angrier. Back in the present, Ryan prepared his horse and reflected on how useful it had been to use that item ahead of schedule compared to the original story. At that moment, his exhausted assistant Sign finally arrived, carrying an enormous backpack. Breathing heavily, Sign greeted the seventh prince and informed him that he had brought everything exactly as ordered. Ryan simply remarked that it had taken him long enough to get there. Putting on a stern expression, he criticized Sign for struggling with such a simple task. Internally, however, Sign was furious. He still couldn't understand how Ryan had survived the wild horse he had deliberately given him in hopes that the prince would get seriously injured. The loud blast of a horn suddenly echoed across the entire area, instantly grabbing everyone's attention. Raising his hand, the emperor officially declared the beginning of the event. The grand hunting competition had finally started. Riders immediately kicked their mounts forward and charged toward the forest at full speed. Some participants dreamed of claiming victory and earning a wish from the emperor, while others already knew the royal family would probably dominate the competition once again. Unlike the rest, Ryan showed no urgency whatsoever. He deliberately kept a low profile, wanting to avoid attracting unnecessary attention. His true objective had nothing to do with winning. He was searching for the former commander of the Imperial Knights, Duke Agony Fetus. At that moment, the Duke was chatting with his assistant, Tolan, who looked unusually excited. Tolan commented that the opening ritual they had just witnessed felt like the display of an actual god. The Duke casually replied that the Emperor's real goal had simply been to crush the spirits of the nobles. The blunt remark shocked Talon, who quickly begged him not to say such things publicly. The old man simply told him to relax, since nobody was listening. Then, with a serious expression, he added that there was probably a reason he had managed to stay alive this long, at least for now. Meanwhile, Ryan rode deeper into the imperial forest while carefully reviewing everything he knew. The enormous hunting grounds were divided into 3 major regions, ranging from areas filled with small animals near the entrance to territories populated by giant beasts deep within the woods. Looking over his map, Ryan analyzed each hunting zone. According to the original story, Duke Agony would eventually present the Emperor with a rare golden fox. The problem was that the novel never explained where the Duke had actually found it. That lack of information was exactly why Ryan had spent so much time flying through the forest in crow form before the competition, trying to locate the creature himself. One detail from the story stood out in his memory. After the hunt, the Duke had washed his hands in a river. Using that clue, Ryan concluded that the fox was probably somewhere near the southwest lake and decided to get there before the Duke could. He was also grateful that Sign had successfully delivered the backpack full of energy stones because he intended to hand them over to Duke Agony later. Unfortunately, things suddenly went off the rails. The massive black horse beneath him began making strange noises and showing obvious discomfort from the weight of the backpack. Without warning, the horse stopped running and reared up violently, nearly throwing Ryan out of the saddle. Confused, Ryan dismounted and examined the animal as it angrily stomped the ground. Concerned, he asked if the horse was sick or if it had sensed a dangerous monster nearby. The horse simply shook its head. Then, a ridiculous possibility crossed Ryan's mind. Staring at the animal suspiciously, he asked if the backpack was simply too heavy. To his disbelief, the horse immediately nodded. Ryan was completely outraged. He complained that ordinary horses pulled entire wagons without throwing tantrums over a little extra weight. He even threatened to cut the horse's food supply if it kept acting stubborn. The horse clearly wasn't impressed. Determined to win the argument, it ignored him completely, kicked the ground aggressively, and suddenly bolted away into the forest. Ryan could only watch in disbelief as the black horse disappeared into the distance, leaving him stranded in the middle of the trail with the heavy backpack. Once the horse vanished from sight, he realized the ridiculous situation he had ended up in, and could only lament being abandoned so shamelessly by his own mount. Elsewhere in the imperial forest, the hunt continued beneath the sunlight filtering through the trees. Talon walked behind Duke Agony and commented with disappointment that their luck seemed terrible today. The Duke sighed and remarked that old age was finally catching up to him. Even after spending his life as the Empire's sword and shield, time remained an opponent he couldn't defeat. Talon quickly tried to encourage him, reminding him that he was still regarded as a living legend throughout the Empire. The assistant spoke about the Duke's glorious years as commander of the Imperial Knights, though the old man merely viewed himself as a retired veteran. Suddenly, the Duke asked whether Talon had ever seen members of the royal family up close. Talon admitted he had only ever glimpsed them from a distance during public ceremonies. The Duke explained that only those who stood directly before the royals could truly understand how imposing they were. His thoughts drifted back to years ago when he used to travel through the capital with his young son in a carriage. Back then, he would proudly point out the royal family and tell his son they were as magnificent as gods. He often spoke about how he was growing old and hoped the boy would someday succeed him in serving the empire. While riding through the city, he would proudly point toward the merchant fleets supplying the royal family and explain the greatness of the kingdom. He even planned to show his son the magnificent temple they were about to visit. Then the memory took a dark turn. Their carriage suddenly jolted violently, causing the driver to apologize and explain that something had become lodged beneath one of the wheels. The driver urgently asked the Duke to remain inside while he handled the situation. Looking outside, the Duke saw the lifeless body of a young boy lying in the middle of the cobblestone street. The luxurious imperial carriage wheel had been stained by the accident. He soon learned that the child was a homeless boy who had been caught attempting to steal sacred offerings from the temple. A nearby guard coldly remarked that deaths like this happened every day and were nothing unusual. Curious about the commotion, the Duke's son tried to step outside and see what had happened. The Duke immediately shouted with terrifying intensity, ordering him not to leave the carriage. Startled, the boy froze as his father physically blocked the door and insisted he must not look outside under any circumstances. Hiding his sorrow, the Duke quietly told his son that nothing important was happening. Back in the present, walking through the forest, the old knight remembered that the dead child hadn't even been 10 years old. The memory still haunted him. The boy had been younger than his own son, forcing the Duke to question the dark reality hidden beneath the Empire's grandeur. His thoughts were interrupted when Talon hurried over and reminded him they didn't have time to admire the scenery if they wanted to preserve their family's honor in the tournament. Shaking off the memories, the Duke apologized for drifting off and revealed that he knew a secret location nearby where the elusive golden fox usually eventually appeared. Meanwhile, Ryan was practically dying as he dragged himself through the forest, carrying the absurdly heavy backpack. Exhausted and drenched in sweat, he swore that the moment he got his hands on that stubborn horse again, it was getting turned into barbecue. The weight of the magic stones was so ridiculous that he couldn't even transform into a crow and fly, making his search for Duke Agony far more difficult than expected. Even though this section of the Imperial Forest was considered the small animal zone, Ryan knew it was still dangerous for someone wandering around on foot without a weapon. Suddenly, rustling noises came from a nearby bush, instantly putting him on alert. His heart nearly jumped out of his chest as he imagined some dangerous creature approaching. The problem was that he hadn't brought any weapon with him and had no intention of abandoning the precious backpack. Acting purely on instinct, Ryan grabbed one of the heavy stones and hurled it at high speed toward the suspicious sound. Unfortunately, his aim was a little too good. The stone flew straight through the bushes and smashed directly into Talon's face. The impact was brutal. The poor assistant let out a painful scream before collapsing onto the forest floor. Hidden behind a nearby tree, Ryan stared in disbelief at the disaster he had just created. Meanwhile, Duke Agony immediately shouted for his assistant and rushed toward him. Ryan quickly crouched lower behind the bushes, desperately hoping they wouldn't discover him. The moment he spotted the unconscious man's blue hair, he instantly recognized him as Talon. Blood was already running down the assistant's face, and before long he passed out completely. Ryan's nerves went into overdrive. Out of all the ways he could have met the legendary Duke, accidentally launching a rock into his assistant's face had never crossed his mind. Standing only a short distance away was one of the Empire's greatest war heroes, the former commander of the Imperial Knights and the future mentor of the novel's true protagonist. This was the man who would eventually help shake the entire Empire. Ryan knew revealing himself now would be a complete disaster. Hidden behind the tree, he frantically tried to think of a solution. His original plan had already fallen apart. He had wanted to find the Golden Fox before the Duke, accuse him of attempting to steal royal prey, and then force him to carry the backpack full of energy stones as punishment throughout the tournament. Instead, he had accidentally assaulted the Duke's assistant. While Ryan was having a silent meltdown, Duke Agony picked up the stone and immediately noticed how unusually heavy it was. Rather than assuming it was an accident, he concluded that someone had deliberately thrown it. In fact, he began suspecting that the true target wasn't Talon at all, but himself. A moment later, the injured assistant groaned and regained a bit of consciousness. The Duke quickly reassured him and asked if he remembered anything about the attacker. Ryan nearly had a heart attack. He knew exactly how powerful the Duke was, and if Talon described him even slightly, his entire situation would become a nightmare. Still dizzy and bleeding, Talon slowly tried to recall what he had seen. Ryan bit his lip in pure panic as the assistant struggled to describe the mysterious figure. After a painfully dramatic pause, Talon finally admitted that everything had happened too fast and that he hadn't seen anything at all. Ryan almost collapsed from relief. For one glorious second, it looked like disaster had been avoided. Then fate decided to make things worse. The Duke suddenly heard the sound of branches snapping nearby. His eyes immediately sharpened as he realized someone was still hiding close by and had been watching the entire exchange. Ryan instantly understood he had been busted. Without wasting another second, he grabbed the backpack and ran for his life. The Duke ordered Talon to stay where he was before charging after the intruder with sword in hand. A frantic chase erupted through the forest. Ryan sprinted between trees while carrying the absurdly heavy backpack, his legs screaming in protest. He desperately tried to convince himself he had already created enough distance to lose an elderly man. Then he glanced backward and nearly cried. Duke Agony was still right behind him, moving at a completely insane speed. The old knight shouted for him to stop and reveal his identity, making Ryan realize he was only seconds away from being caught. Desperate, he considered abandoning the backpack so he could transform into a crow. At that moment, he bitterly regretted ever being abandoned by his horse. With no better options left, he activated one of his hidden abilities to increase his speed. To his shock, his legs suddenly began transforming into the powerful hind legs of a horse. The burst of acceleration was immediate. Even the Duke looked confused as the fleeing figure's silhouette seemed to distort and change shape while rapidly pulling away. Despite his incredible strength, the Duke could no longer keep up. Frustration filled him as he watched the mysterious intruder vanish into the distance. Grinding his teeth, he wondered if old age was finally affecting his eyesight, because he could have sworn the target had started transforming while running. Eventually, he was forced to stop in an empty clearing and catch his breath, annoyed that the chase had ended with him losing sight of his quarry. Meanwhile, Ryan experienced something even stranger. His body suddenly felt unbelievably light, and his movement no longer felt human. As he continued racing forward, he heard the unmistakable sound of galloping hooves. For a brief moment, he actually wondered if his runaway horse had somehow returned to rescue him, but the truth became obvious when he caught sight of his own reflection. Staring at what he had become, Ryan realized something absolutely insane had happened. Somewhere during his desperate escape, he had fully transformed into a magnificent black racehorse. Elsewhere in the forest, one of the princes stumbled across something shocking. Lying before him was the freshly hunted corpse of a gigantic, monstrous creature. The blonde prince smiled in surprise and asked his brother if he had really managed to bring down such a legendary beast so early into the competition. Another prince congratulated the hunter and curiously asked what wish he planned to request from the emperor after securing such an impressive achievement. Wearing an enigmatic smile that carried a rather dark undertone, the prince calmly revealed that he already had something very special in mind. Meanwhile, in another part of the forest, Ryan sat against a tree trunk and let out a long sigh. He buried his hands in his hair as despair washed over him. Looking down, he suddenly realized the worst possible outcome had happened. Somewhere during his desperate escape from the Duke, he had lost the backpack filled with energy stones. The realization hit him so hard that he started rolling around in the grass, cursing his unbelievable bad luck and complaining that the tournament had gone far beyond the limits of acceptable disaster. After a few moments of self-pity, he admitted that lying around wouldn't solve anything. With no other choice, he got back on his feet and began retracing his steps in search of the missing backpack. Not far away, Tolan was still resting beside a tree when he noticed Duke Agony returning from the failed chase. Brightening up immediately, he asked about the outcome. The Duke first checked whether his assistant's head was feeling better. Tolan admitted he was still sore and dizzy, but otherwise fine. Embarrassingly, the Duke confessed that he had completely lost the intruder. He wasn't sure whether the target had simply been too fast or if he was finally feeling the effects of old age. During the conversation, Tolan pointed toward a leather backpack lying nearby. The Duke explained that he had found it abandoned along the path during the pursuit. When Tolan opened it, he became completely confused. The bag was filled with what appeared to be ordinary rocks. Hidden behind a nearby tree, Ryan watched the scene unfold while sweating bullets. They had found the exact backpack he had been desperately searching for. Panicking, he immediately jumped out of hiding and pointed toward the bag. The sudden appearance startled both men. The moment Tolan recognized him as the seventh prince, he and the Duke instantly dropped to their knees. Maintaining a calm expression, Ryan claimed he had merely been searching for his lost backpack. Then, putting on the attitude of a spoiled and unreasonable noble, he angrily demanded to know why they had his belongings and openly accused them of stealing it. The Duke immediately denied the accusation and respectfully explained that he had only discovered the backpack abandoned in the grass. Ryan continued pressing him until the old knight practically swore on his family's honor that he was telling the truth. Ryan then shifted his attention toward Tolan and asked why the assistant's face was covered in blood. The Duke awkwardly explained that they had suffered a sudden accident. Throughout the exchange, Tolan remained silent with his head lowered. At the same time, vague memories were beginning to surface in his mind. He faintly remembered seeing the silhouette of Prince Ryan just before the stone struck him. As he prepared to speak up, Ryan suddenly stepped forward and grabbed him aggressively by the hair. In a cold and hostile tone, he berated the assistant for daring to interrupt a conversation between nobles, calling him an uneducated brat. Then Ryan casually asked the Duke if he could borrow a sword to personally deal with the problem. The threat instantly drained the color from Tolan's face. Terrified, he began pleading for his life. The Duke quickly apologized on his assistant's behalf and begged for mercy, promising to punish the boy himself if necessary. Watching this, Ryan couldn't help thinking bitterly about how easily the Duke was willing to sacrifice his own subordinate. In Ryan's eyes, the old knight behaved like a loyal dog serving the royal family without question. He even recalled that the Duke's son would one day grow into the exact same kind of loyal servant. For a brief moment, Ryan remembered the frightened face of that innocent child from the Duke's memories. Then, changing his demeanor, he smiled and claimed their encounter must have been fate. Handing the backpack over, he warned the Duke that the contents were extremely valuable and that losing them was absolutely unacceptable. The old war hero clutched the bag tightly and solemnly promised to obey the prince's instructions without question. After wishing them a successful hunt, Ryan finally left. Internally, he admitted his acting had been terrible and felt a little guilty for frightening Tolan, but he knew this encounter had served an important purpose. After Ryan departed, Tolan apologized repeatedly, clearly ashamed of everything that had happened. The Duke simply told him to be grateful he was still alive and suggested they return to rest. Suddenly, the assistant remembered something important. He confidently stated that he had finally figured out who had thrown the stone at him. According to Tolan, the true culprit was none other than Prince Ryan himself. However, before he could explain his reasoning, the Duke immediately cut him off and ordered him to stop talking about it. Ryan's objective had never been the backpack or even the hunting competition. In the original novel, Duke Agony would launch a massive rebellion during the following year's tournament after the tragic death of his beloved son. Ryan wanted that rebellion to happen sooner. To accomplish that, all he needed was to give the Duke a small push in the right direction. Elsewhere, Rasha was already preparing the wish he intended to request from the Emperor. He planned to fund large-scale development projects around the Sacred Temple region. On the surface, it it sounded beneficial, but his true goal was far darker. The project would force the homeless and impoverished residents out of the capital permanently. Watching events unfold from a distance, Ryan coldly reflected that Duke Agony's fate was now completely sealed. The old knight walked through the forest looking troubled and thoughtful after everything he had experienced that day. Whether he realized it or not, he was destined to one day stand against the royal family. As evening gradually covered the imperial forest in a beautiful crimson glow, the hunting competition approached its end. Hidden behind a patch of bushes, Ryan carefully checked his surroundings to make sure nobody was watching him. Looking toward the nobles' tents, he reflected on how convincingly he had played the role of a ruthless villain. Then he quickly reminded himself that being a villain was exactly the role he was supposed to play. While planning his next move for the closing ceremony, he suddenly sensed someone standing behind him. The unexpected presence made him freeze. Turning around, he found himself face to face with the kingdom's first princess, Manhwa. She greeted him kindly and remarked that it was unusual to see him wandering through the forest alone. Ryan immediately became tense. Out of all the people he could have encountered, the first princess was one of the most dangerous. He offered a formal greeting, but she gently asked him to stop being so formal with his own sister. Curious, she asked where he had left his horse. Ryan quickly lied and claimed he had left it at his quarters before deciding to take a walk. The princess stared at him with a suspicious expression and bluntly stated that his explanation made no sense. Then she directly accused him of lying to his own blood sister. Ryan swallowed hard but forced himself to remain calm as he asked what exactly she meant. Manhwa revealed that she had personally seen his black horse running loose through the western forest without a rider. After learning from the servants that the animal belonged to him, she had already ordered it to be put down. According to her, any animal that disobeyed royalty deserved elimination. Ryan immediately dropped to one knee and apologized, pretending to be ashamed that he had lost control of the horse. The princess gently told him to stand up, explaining that she had no desire to appear as though she were punishing her younger brother. She expressed relief that he had returned safely, and even offered to lend him one of her own horses whenever he needed one. Ryan watched her leave while remaining deeply unsettled. Manhwa was an incredibly dangerous woman because she never allowed her true thoughts to show. The entire conversation felt wrong. He couldn't understand why she had chosen to let the matter end so peacefully. As he watched her disappear into the distance, he couldn't help wondering whether her mysterious magical ability had somehow failed to work on him. Night finally settled over the royal camp. Inside one of the large noble tents, the camp doctor examined Talon's injury with a puzzled expression. According to the explanation he had been given, the assistant had supposedly tripped over a rock and smashed his head against another while running. The doctor admitted he had never seen someone suffer such a serious injury from a simple fall during any previous hunting tournament. Duke Agony asked how long the recovery would take, and the doctor replied that the wound was severe enough to require at least a week of bed rest. Hearing that, Talon immediately protested. As the Duke's assistant, he insisted he needed to remain at his lord's side. The Duke simply placed a hand on his shoulder and acknowledged his loyalty, before firmly stating that recovery came first. He ordered Talon to stay in bed and rest until the closing ceremony. Rather than remaining disappointed, the young assistant suddenly broke into a huge smile and promised to dedicate himself completely to resting. The Duke laughed and joked that Talon was probably the first assistant in tournament history to treat an injury like a vacation. Talon cheerfully admitted that his greatest dream was simply to eat and play all day. Amused by the response, the Duke laughed along and promised that if he won the competition, he would use his reward to request the mining rights to a gold mine for him. Later that night, the entire camp fell silent beneath the dim glow of a single candle. Exhausted from both his injury and the pain medication, Talon quickly drifted into a deep sleep, snoring loudly in his bed. While he slept peacefully, an unseen hand quietly entered the tent and placed a rolled, sealed document beside his pillow before disappearing without a trace. Elsewhere, Ryan couldn't help mocking the royal family's so-called loyalty. In his eyes, they treated their servants as nothing more than disposable tools to be used and discarded whenever convenient. He knew Duke Agony's rebellion was drawing closer with every passing day. Eventually, the endless abuses of the royal family would push the old warrior beyond his breaking point. Meanwhile, sleep refused to come to the Duke. Restless and troubled, he climbed out of bed and prepared to take a walk outside. Just before leaving the tent, however, something unexpected caught his attention. Sitting on a nearby stand was the luxurious backpack Ryan had entrusted to him earlier. The strange energy stones inside were producing an odd rattling noise, as though they were shifting and striking each other on their own. Without really thinking about it, the Duke picked up the incredibly heavy bag and carried it with him into the night. As he walked through the darkness, old memories surfaced in his mind. He recalled conversations with his father about the Empire's origins and the sacred temple. Back then, his father had enthusiastically spoken about a divine savior who descended from the heavens during an age of endless war and chaos. Young Agony had proudly responded that he already knew the story from his history books and recognized the figure as the Great Sierra. According to the legends, Sierra possessed mysterious powers and had succeeded where countless rulers failed. More than 1,000 years ago, the divine being united the warring lands and founded the Iberian Empire, becoming the ancestor of the royal bloodline itself. The Duke's thoughts soon drifted toward his beloved son, Flynn. To him, Flynn was the most precious thing in the entire world. As he walked through the forest carrying the backpack, he silently swore once again to remain the Empire's faithful sword and shield, and to continue protecting the Iberian family with unwavering loyalty. Then reality abruptly interrupted his thoughts. Looking down at the absurdly heavy bag of stones hanging from his shoulder, he suddenly wondered why he was carrying it around in the middle of the night. Was it loyalty, stubbornness, or something else entirely? Before he could think further, a loud horn blast echoed across the forest. The unexpected signal immediately caught his attention, making him wonder if something major had happened. The following day, every noble gathered at the competition grounds was left stunned by an unbelievable announcement. During a single night, First Prince Rasha had used his overwhelming power to nearly wipe out every monster within the hunting grounds by himself. The achievement was so absurd that he effectively ended a tournament designed to last 4 full days in only one night. His victory wasn't just decisive, it was historic. Standing before the assembled crowd, Rasha was officially declared the undisputed winner of the hunting competition. The emperor congratulated his eldest son for the crushing performance, and Rasha respectfully thanked him while maintaining the flawless posture expected of imperial royalty. Following tradition, the emperor then ordered him to announce the wish he wanted granted. As whispers spread through the audience, many nobles eagerly speculated about what reward he would request. Among them stood Duke Agony, watching nervously. Then Rasha finally revealed his wish. He claimed that the sacred temple's surroundings had become overrun with beggars and undesirables who threatened the site's security and dignity. To restore the temple's former glory, he requested authorization for large-scale restoration and development projects across the entire region. The moment those words left Rasha's mouth, Duke Agony froze. Unlike most people present, he immediately understood what the proposal truly meant. Memories flooded back into his mind, images of imperial soldiers mercilessly removing innocent poor families from the area in the past. This wasn't restoration. It wasn't purification. It was a death sentence for countless helpless people living around the temple. The Duke felt his chest tighten as he remembered his father and the ideals he had inherited. Was blind loyalty really worth this price? Was faithfully serving the Empire worth ignoring the suffering of innocent children? He mentally called out to his late father while a crushing sense of anguish settled over him. To continue being the Empire's loyal hound would mean pretending not to see the coming massacre. For years, he had endured and obeyed, but this time, something finally broke. Unable to tolerate the injustice any longer, Duke Agony made his decision. In front of the Emperor, the royal family, and the gathered nobles, he slowly drew his shining sword. As he did, he silently apologized to his beloved son Flynn for abandoning the oath their family had upheld for generations. Meanwhile, inside the medical tent, Talon suddenly woke up and nearly had a heart attack. Hovering directly over his bed was an upside-down figure staring at him with a completely blank expression. Ryan stood there silently, watching him without a hint of emotion. Startled, Talon immediately tried to jump up and greet the prince, but Ryan sharply ordered him not to move so quickly unless he wanted to make himself dizzy. He then coldly advised him to use olive leaves on the injury before abruptly changing the subject. Ryan asked whether Talon seriously had no idea about the massive trouble Duke Agony was currently facing. The words instantly erased any remaining sleepiness. When Talon realized the closing ceremony had already begun without him, his eyes widened in panic. He bolted out of the medical tent and sprinted toward the gathering of nobles. Pushing through the crowd with desperate urgency, he ignored everyone in his path until he finally reached the front. The moment he saw what was happening, he froze in horror. Right before the Emperor himself, First Prince Rasha was preparing to execute Duke Agony. Rasha's face twisted with fury as he demanded to know why the Duke had committed the heresy of interrupting the sacred closing ceremony. In response, Duke Agony calmly explained that his family had faithfully protected both the Empire and the royal family for over 1,000 years. Because of that legacy, he requested permission for his family to personally assume responsibility for the security of the sacred temple. In reality, he was trying to prevent Rasha from carrying out the massacre of the poor and helpless people living around it. To everyone's shock, the Emperor granted the request. Acknowledging the Duke's centuries of loyalty, he agreed to place the responsibility in his hands. However, he couldn't resist pointing out the irony. The same loyalty the Duke proudly claimed had led him to stand against the royal family's wishes. Rasha immediately exploded with rage. Refusing to accept the interruption, he unleashed the full force of his water magic and charged forward. The crown prince declared that such insolence deserved the ultimate punishment. Duke Agony lowered his head and calmly accepted the judgment, stating that if interrupting the ceremony was a crime, he was willing to pay for it with his life. Watching from the crowd, Talon screamed in desperation for his lord. Nearby, Ryan observed everything with chilling calm, silently thinking how perfect this moment would be if the novel's true protagonist happened to witness it. Far away from the ceremony, deep within a peaceful section of the imperial forest, a mysterious, hooded young man crouched beside a river collecting water. Suddenly, the flowing stream began glowing with intense blue magical energy. Startled, The young man looked around, trying to determine where such an overwhelming surge of power was coming from. The glowing torrent swept through the forest like a living current, carrying with it a glimpse of the royal family's terrifying strength. The young man watched carefully as the magical energy spread across the land. This wasn't just some random traveler. Standing there was the true protagonist of the story, the legendary young man known as Rattel. Back at the ceremony, Duke Agony, the hero whose family had protected the royal bloodline for more than a millennium, was now being treated like a criminal. Rasha personally took it upon himself to carry out the execution in the name of the royal family. A massive sphere of water suddenly engulfed the Duke, trapping him inside and cutting off his ability to breathe. The spectators immediately panicked as they watched the old warrior slowly suffocate. Locked inside the crushing prison of water, Agony struggled for air while his vision began to blur. Within that watery prison, his gaze eventually landed on Tulin. The sight immediately caught his attention. He wondered why the boy had left the medical tent and come all the way there. Realizing that Tulin had likely exaggerated his injury, the Duke felt relieved to see him alive and well. As he stared at the desperate young assistant, regret filled his heart. He silently wished he could tell Tulin to look after his beloved son Flynn after he was gone. Then something unexpected pulled his attention away. Standing among the crowd, completely calm amidst the chaos, was Prince Ryan. The Duke narrowed his eyes, trying to understand what the young prince was silently mouthing. Ryan's lips moved without making a sound, but the message was clear. It wasn't the Duke's time to die yet. Those words reignited something inside him. The old warrior's resolve returned instantly. He refused to accept death there. At the same time, Rasha gathered even more magical power. A colossal pillar of blue light erupted into the heavens as an enormous sphere of energy illuminated the entire forest. The water barrier surrounding the Duke came under tremendous strain and slowly began cracking apart. Rasha raised his hand to deliver the final judgment, while Tulin watched helplessly from outside, restrained by those around him. Meanwhile, Ryan simply continued observing the situation with a thoughtful expression. Elsewhere, the shockwaves of that immense power began attracting attention across the empire. A young boy quietly writing in a notebook suddenly stopped and looked out the window after noticing a brilliant beam of magical light streaking across the sky. Deep within the forest, Rattel also spotted the mysterious glow. Instantly recognizing that something unusual was happening, he sprinted toward it without hesitation. Moving at incredible speed, he leaped forward and landed with enough force to shake the ground around him. Driven by determination, he pushed onward until he finally reached the area where the massive energy barrier was concentrated. The blinding light made it difficult to see clearly, but after staring into the glow, he thought he could make out a silhouette trapped inside. Without fear, Rattel jumped directly toward the strange phenomenon. Reaching out, he touched the magical barrier in an attempt to understand what it was. The moment contact was made, a violent reaction occurred. A massive explosion of water erupted outward, sending waves crashing in every direction. Rattel managed to land safely on solid ground, but when he looked around, the energy trail was already fading into the sky beyond the mountains. Standing at the edge of a cliff, he carefully studied the destruction left behind. Something about the entire situation felt deeply wrong. As the final traces of magical energy vanished into the distance, Rattel turned back with a suspicious look, convinced that something far more serious was unfolding behind the scenes. Back at the ceremony, Tulin was devastated by what appeared to be the death of Duke Agony. The crowd whispered among themselves about the fallen hero's tragic end and speculated about the future of the fetus family. Treating the matter as finished, the emperor ordered preparations for the final ceremony at noon. One by one, nobles and participants began leaving the arena. Rasha casually wiped his hands and dismissed the Duke's death as the crushing of an insignificant bug. He openly remarked that excessive mercy only created rebellious fools. As the crowd dispersed, many nobles mocked the late Duke behind his back, calling him an idiot and predicting the complete collapse of his family. Meanwhile, Tulin walked through the crowd alone with his head lowered. Some nobles even spat near him and branded him a traitor's servant, but he ignored every insult. Watching from a distance, Ryan knew the young assistant's heart had been shattered. Even so, he was convinced that Tulin's spirit wouldn't break. After returning to the Duke's tent, Tulin began cleaning up the scattered belongings left behind. While sorting through the mess, he discovered a sealed letter hidden beneath a pile of fabric. Recognizing the fetus family seal, he immediately opened it. The letter contained Duke Agony's final words. The old warrior wrote that if Tulin was reading it, he was likely already gone. He made one last request, asking his loyal assistant to look after his son Flynn. Agony confessed that he felt he was about to make a terrible mistake and wanted to ensure Tulin bore no responsibility for whatever happened afterward. As the letter continued, it revealed something completely unexpected. Moved by the Duke's sincerity, Tulin dropped the paper and collapsed to the floor in tears. The letter officially named him the substitute head of the entire fetus family. Meanwhile, inside one of the royal chambers, Ryan discussed Rasha's deteriorating condition. He pointed out that the first prince's reckless use of magic during the tournament had significantly worsened his illness. The remark immediately infuriated Rasha, who demanded answers regarding the dark stone that was supposedly absorbing the corrupted energy inside him. Ryan calmly explained that his brother needed to release his power much more slowly if he wanted to avoid accelerating his decline. Looking into Rasha's eyes, Ryan could clearly see the hatred building there. He knew the Crown Prince was already plotting revenge. Still, Ryan reminded him that there was no instant cure for his condition, and that he was only alive because of the stone. Elsewhere, Ryan briefly thought about the rumors claiming Talon remained unconscious. Despite everything, he felt a small amount of guilt and wondered whether the assistant would actually survive. Around that same time, Talon finally opened his eyes. Disoriented, he struggled to understand where he was. A servant quickly informed him that he had spent over 2 weeks unconscious. Ignoring all advice to rest, Talon immediately asked about Flynn and the family's situation. The servant sadly explained that most business partners had withdrawn their support, many employees had abandoned the household, and their finances were collapsing. Worse still, no one could ask the royal family for assistance because Duke Agony had been branded a traitor. As Tolan processed the grim news, a small voice echoed through the hallway. Little Flynn had arrived. The moment he saw the boy, Tolan became emotional and rushed forward before dropping to his knees in apology. He blamed himself for causing so much worry. Flynn sadly explained that countless problems had appeared after his father's death and that they hadn't even managed to organize a proper memorial service. During their conversation, Tolan overheard cruel gossip coming from outside the window. Curious, he listened more carefully and heard people spreading rumors about Flynn's birth while discussing plans to flee before they suffered punishment for being associated with traitors. The comments made it clear that the stain attached to the fetus family name would be difficult to erase. When Tolan turned back toward the room, his expression had completely changed. Calling for one of the servants, he coldly ordered that the gossipers outside have their tongues cut out as punishment. The servant was horrified by the command, but when Tolan asked if he needed to repeat himself, the man could only bow and obey. Then Tolan announced another shocking decision. There would be no memorial service. According to him, the former duke could no longer be considered part of the proud fetus family. Flynn tearfully demanded an explanation, but Tolan remained firm. As the newly appointed family leader, it was now his duty to preserve the family's honor and protect the clan until Flynn came of age. Removing his glasses with unwavering resolve, he declared that he would use whatever methods were necessary to keep the fetus family standing. Elsewhere, tension continued building inside Rasha's quarters. Consumed by rage, the first prince smashed furniture and valuables throughout his room. Unable to accept his current state, he vented his frustration until he was left exhausted and struggling to breathe. A maid who entered the room was immediately frightened by the destruction surrounding him. Rasha swore he would crush every one of his enemies. Meanwhile, Ryan calmly informed him about an appointment planned for the following day and requested that rumors be spread, claiming he would be entering the imperial forest. Confused, Rasha questioned why Ryan would bother spreading such information if he had no intention of actually going there. Ryan explained that he needed to keep his true location hidden while handling important business. Growing increasingly suspicious, Rasha demanded to know what kind of scheme required such secrecy. Ryan answered with a sarcastic smile, claiming it was related to the treatment. The response only enraged the crown prince further. Completely losing control, Rasha grabbed Ryan and slammed him against a wall, declaring that the Empire's sages could easily provide a cure. He attempted to choke Ryan using water magic while threatening to kill him on the spot. Even while being attacked, Ryan continued smiling mockingly and encouraged him to consult the sages if he was so confident. The moment Rasha pushed his power too far, his condition immediately worsened. He began coughing violently and spat blood onto the floor. Ryan calmly stood up and reminded him that every use of magic shortened his lifespan. He warned that stopping the treatment would eventually leave him unable to move at all. Then Ryan mocked him further, questioning how the royal family would react if the mighty crown prince suddenly collapsed. As Rasha struggled on the floor, Ryan continued hammering away at his pride, reminding him that another heir would gladly claim the throne if he failed. Grabbing his brother's face, Ryan coldly warned him to start thinking instead of acting recklessly. Before leaving, he advised Rasha to abandon any plans of following him because he already knew how to disappear without leaving a trace. After leaving the room, Ryan reflected on his own motivations. Moments later, he transformed into a black crow and soared through the sky, carrying a small leather pouch in his claws. His destination was the imperial forest. Landing in a secluded area, he shed his feathers and returned to human form. Looking around, he proudly noted that he had already cleared the area of every living creature. He had deliberately chosen the location because he wanted to study his mysterious transformation powers without interruptions. Ryan strongly suspected he could transform into multiple species and wanted to determine exactly where the limits of that ability lay. To understand the power completely, he needed to identify every condition required to unlock new transformations. Based on his previous experiences, he theorized that physical contact with an animal might be the key. Since he had already transformed into both a crow and a horse after direct contact, the pattern seemed promising. Determined to test the theory properly, Ryan built a simple wooden trap among the bushes. Using expensive fruits stolen from the imperial kitchen as bait, He prepared to catch a small animal and see whether contact with it would unlock yet another transformation. While setting up his trap in the forest, Ryan suddenly heard the sound of rustling leaves and immediately went on alert. Looking up, he spotted a cute squirrel carefully observing the wooden trap from a nearby tree. The sight caught him off guard. He hadn't even finished preparing the trap yet, and his target had already shown up. To his surprise, the squirrel quickly scampered down the trunk and approached him without the slightest fear. Before Ryan could react, the tiny creature climbed directly onto the hand holding the bait. Amused by its boldness, he jokingly remarked that trusting strangers so easily was a terrible survival strategy. Since he had finally achieved physical contact with another animal, Ryan decided it was the perfect opportunity to test his theory. Planting his feet firmly, he focused all of his concentration on transforming into a squirrel. A bright yellow energy immediately began radiating from his body. For a moment, it looked like the transformation was actually working. Then the glow abruptly faded, leaving him standing there exactly as he was, still human. Ryan frowned and began analyzing the failure. Maybe physical contact alone wasn't enough. He started wondering whether emotions or instinctive urges played a role. Perhaps he needed to genuinely experience a squirrel's desire to climb trees or gather food before the ability would activate. Before he could continue experimenting, disaster struck. The squirrel suddenly grabbed his backpack filled with valuable energy stones and bolted away at incredible speed. Ryan nearly had a heart attack. The little thief was making off with some of his most important possessions. Panicking, he immediately sprinted after it through the forest while desperately trying to get the backpack back. Somehow, he managed to catch hold of one of the straps at the last second. Unfortunately, the squirrel refused to surrender. Clinging stubbornly to the prize, it raced up a tree while dragging the backpack with it. Ryan pulled back with all his strength while the squirrel fought from the opposite side. What followed was a completely ridiculous tug-of-war between a prince and a squirrel. For a brief moment, neither side gave ground. Then fate intervened. The strap suddenly snapped under the pressure. Ryan instantly lost his balance and crashed flat onto his back while the squirrel escaped once again. By the time the exhausting chase finally ended, he had accomplished absolutely nothing except spending the entire day getting humiliated by a tiny woodland criminal. Later that night, the imperial palace rested beneath a sky filled with glowing moons and countless stars. One of the maids gently knocked on Ryan's door and informed him that dinner had arrived. After receiving permission to enter, she carefully stepped inside carrying a food tray. Silently, she prayed she could complete the task without attracting the prince's anger. The moment she entered, however, she nearly jumped out of her skin. Ryan's clothes were completely covered in dirt, leaves, and dust. When questioned, Ryan casually made up an excuse about taking a walk through the palace gardens. Internally, he was relieved that nobody had discovered his activities in crow form. At the same time, he couldn't help regretting that he had wasted an entire day chasing a squirrel only to learn absolutely nothing about his powers. While placing the food down, the maid noticed something strange beside him and stared at it curiously. Ryan asked her to fetch fresh clothes because he intended to take a bath, but instead of moving, she hesitated awkwardly. Confused by her reaction, he asked what was wrong. Nervously pointing toward the bag, she asked whether he had intentionally brought that little creature back with him. Ryan followed her gaze and immediately froze. To his utter disbelief, the squirrel had somehow snuck into his backpack and followed him all the way back to the palace. As if mocking him, the little troublemaker jumped out and began running around the room. Ryan immediately chased after it while the maid panicked. Convinced the prince was about to kill the animal, she desperately begged him to spare its life. Ryan ignored the misunderstanding completely and simply repeated his order to fetch new clothes. Unfortunately, the maid was so distracted by the squirrel that she failed to move. Losing patience, Ryan finally snapped and shouted at her to bring the clothes already. Terrified, she practically launched herself out of the room and sprinted through the palace corridors. The entire way, she worried that if she took too long, the poor squirrel would meet a terrible fate at the prince's hands. However, her frantic escape came to an abrupt halt when she rounded a corner and nearly collided with one of the most intimidating figures in the entire palace. Standing directly in her path was the first princess, Mentil Abiran. The maid froze instantly. Mentil immediately recognized her as one of Ryan's servants and calmly asked why she was running around in such a hurry. The terrified maid dropped to the floor and began begging for forgiveness. The princess then noticed the bundle of clothing in her hands and became suspicious. For a moment, she wondered if the servant had stolen them. Panicking, the maid swore she had done nothing wrong and quickly explained that Prince Ryan had merely dirtied his clothes. Mentil slowly extended her glowing hand toward the servant. In a cold voice, she warned that lying to her was pointless because she would uncover the truth regardless. Activating her unique mind-reading ability, the princess searched through the maid's memories to verify the story. The moment she saw what the servant had witnessed, her glowing eyes widened slightly in surprise. Instead of finding memories of Ryan strolling through a garden, she saw images of him covered in dried leaves and forest debris. Mentil instantly realized her younger brother had been somewhere far different than he claimed. As the pieces started falling into place, an enigmatic smile slowly appeared on the first princess's face. That night, the scene shifted to Ryan's room. The mysterious squirrel had somehow found its way inside once again, and Ryan had finally had enough. Looking at the tiny creature, he calmly explained that the palace was no place for it to live. He had no intention of keeping it as a pet, and if possible, he wanted to return it safely to the forest before someone else captured it. Extending a hand toward the squirrel, he tried to reassure it, but the little animal immediately assumed a defensive stance and let out a wary squeak. Watching its reaction, Ryan could not help feeling uneasy. Even for an ordinary squirrel, casually roaming around a human's room, especially inside the royal palace, made no sense. The sight also brought back unpleasant memories of his previous life, when he used to lie awake in his cramped semi-basement apartment, listening to rats scratching inside the walls at night. On top of that, the story's events were already beginning to drift away from the original plot, something that irritated him even more. Deciding not to waste any more time, Ryan lunged toward the squirrel and, to his surprise, managed to catch it immediately. Relieved, Ryan let out a small sigh and told the squirrel to get into a bag so he could take it back to the forest later. However, the creature responded by sinking its teeth straight into his hand. Ryan cried out in pain and instinctively dropped it. Staring at the runaway squirrel, he angrily scolded the tiny creature, unable to believe that something so small had dared bite royalty. The squirrel paid no attention to his complaints. Instead, it swiftly scaled the wall and perched itself high above the room. Ryan looked up helplessly. Chasing after it would only make it flee somewhere else. As he closed his eyes in frustration, a thought suddenly crossed his mind. In situations like this, things would be much easier if he could simply transform into a squirrel himself. The moment that idea surfaced, an unfamiliar sensation washed over his body. A soft yellow light began surrounding him, and Ryan immediately realized that something was changing. Across the room, the squirrel trembled violently while desperately clinging to the wall, as though it had sensed something terrifying. Looking into the creature's frightened eyes, Ryan finally understood the condition required to transform into a specific animal. Before he could think further, the squirrel suddenly shut its eyes. Its strength gave out completely, and it slipped from the wall. Ryan was startled by the unexpected sight. Regardless of how agile squirrels normally were, falling from that height could still be dangerous. Without hesitation, he rushed forward, determined to catch the tiny creature before it hit the ground. Just then, Mental strode inside the room without the slightest hesitation. The maid immediately protested, insisting that she should knock before entering, but Mental dismissed the complaint entirely. In her eyes, there was no reason for an older sister to walk on eggshells around her younger brother. She even went as far as complaining about how overly cautious and unpleasant the palace servants had become. However, her attention was quickly drawn elsewhere. Standing before her was an absurd sight: two squirrels inside the prince's room, with one of them seemingly cradling the other in its tiny paws. Mental could only stare in disbelief. Although Ryan was a neglected child within the imperial family, she still found it strange that wild animals were freely wandering through a royal residence. Beside her, Maid Anna seemed far less concerned and simply found the squirrels adorable. Meanwhile, Ryan, who was still in squirrel form and holding the unconscious creature, felt his headache growing worse by the second. The entire situation was becoming increasingly ridiculous. The following day, the squirrel that Ryan had saved finally regained consciousness. Much to his surprise, it refused to leave his side and spent the entire morning following him around and playing near him. As Ryan sat at a table, he watched the squirrel nibble on the walnuts he had given it. Since the creature had shown no intention of returning to the forest, Ryan reluctantly decided to let it stay for the time being, warning it to at least remain out of sight and avoid causing trouble. More importantly, he had finally discovered the condition behind his transformation ability. Thinking back, Ryan realized that every animal he had transformed into the crow, the black horse, and now the squirrel, shared one common factor. Before each transformation, he had made precise physical contact with the back of the animal's neck. It was not enough to simply touch them. The contact had to be made exactly at the nape. The condition was absurdly specific, especially for an ability he still considered mostly useless, but at least he had finally figured it out. With that mystery solved, Ryan turned his attention to a far more pressing issue: the first princess, Mentil. The novel had only briefly described her unstable personality, making it difficult for him to imagine her properly, but now he pictured her as someone with an eternally terrifying expression. The previous night, thanks to Anna's assistance, Ryan had managed to sneak back into his room after returning from squirrel form. Unfortunately, Mental had appeared at that exact moment. After briefly commenting on the strange presence of beasts within the palace, and remarking that Ryan had rather unusual tastes, she announced that she would leave since it was already late. Ryan had assumed the conversation was over, and politely agreed, hoping she would simply leave. Instead, Mentil abruptly ordered him to visit her residence the following day. With a cold gaze and an unmistakably commanding tone, she declared that they had matters to discuss. Remembering those words in the present, Ryan could not help feeling anxious. Had Mentil somehow discovered his secret? Did she already know about his true identity? No matter how much he thought about it, that seemed impossible. Still, refusing her invitation was not an option. Letting out a tired yawn, Ryan rose from his seat and glanced toward the squirrel beside him. Whether he liked it or not, he would have to meet her. Sometime later, Ryan arrived at the residence of the first princess. A guard respectfully informed him that the princess was already waiting inside her chambers. Standing before the enormous entrance, Ryan could not help recalling the descriptions from the novel. It had always been described as grand, but seeing the massive doors in person was an entirely different experience. Once inside, he found Mentil elegantly dressed and seated on an extravagant sofa, perfectly embodying the dignity of royalty. She welcomed him warmly and invited him to sit, remarking that the journey must have been exhausting. Ryan, however, brushed it off, pointing out that the distance was not particularly far. More importantly, he wanted to know why she had summoned him in the first place. Mentil ignored the question completely. Maintaining a faint smile, she calmly asked whether Ryan had not heard her request to sit down. Despite the gentle expression on her face, the authority in her voice left no room for refusal. Realizing his mistake, Ryan immediately apologized and took his seat. Mentil let out a soft laugh, commenting that his curiosity had always made him impatient. However, the warmth in her expression soon vanished. Her gaze turned cold as she questioned him about his recent actions, asking when exactly he had become such a different person, especially someone willing to venture alone into the imperial forest, a place he had never shown any interest in before. Ryan had anticipated this conversation from the very beginning. This was precisely why he had wanted to avoid meeting the first princess. In this world, every member of the imperial family possessed a unique Manus ability tied to nature. The emperor wielded the fire Manus, while the crown prince controlled water Manus. Mentil's power, however, was on an entirely different level. Her Manus was human Manus, an ability that allowed her to read and manipulate people's minds. As Mentil gently placed her hand on Ryan's head, she calmly stated that she hoped he would answer honestly, because nothing saddened her more than being deceived by her beloved family. Internally, Ryan forced himself to remain calm. Fortunately, he already knew something crucial from the novel. Mentil's ability did not work on him. If it had, she would have simply controlled him and extracted the truth directly. He suspected she had already realized this fact herself. According to the novel, her ability failed under two conditions. First, the target had to be related to her by blood, and second, that person had to genuinely love her. While Ryan fulfilled the first condition, there was absolutely no chance he could ever feel familial affection towards someone as terrifying as Mentil. As she continued smiling patiently and urged him to answer, Ryan could only wonder why exactly her powers were ineffective against him. Elsewhere, near the waterfall caves, another unexpected event was unfolding. Deep inside the cavern, a single droplet of water fell onto the face of the unconscious Duke Agony. Moments later, the Duke slowly regained consciousness, immediately feeling intense pain throughout his body. Still disoriented, he struggled to understand where he was, unsure whether he had somehow returned to Terium or ended up somewhere else entirely. It was then that he noticed a hooded figure sitting nearby. The mysterious person casually remarked that Duke Agony's survival was surprising, leaving the Duke visibly stunned. As the hooded individual rose to his feet, Duke Agony hurriedly demanded answers, asking who the stranger was, where he was, and whether he was even still alive. The man simply replied that the Duke had remained unconscious for so long that he had assumed he was dead. Then, without another word, the stranger slowly unsheathed his sword. Pointing the blade directly at the Duke's face, he coldly asked a single question: whether the Duke remained loyal to the Iberan Empire. Confused, the Duke demanded to know what the question meant, but the swordsman showed no interest in explaining. With an icy stare, he repeated that the answer would determine exactly how he intended to proceed next. Ryan remained seated as countless thoughts raced through his mind. Mentil's ability was clearly failing to affect him, but he could not understand why. There had to be a reason. Perhaps it had something to do with the fact that he now possessed the body of the seventh prince. After all, the original seventh prince had been such an insignificant character that the novel barely provided any information about him. He had appeared only a handful of times throughout the story. As Ryan struggled to organize his thoughts, Mentil looked down at him with her usual cold expression and asked once more why he had suddenly changed so drastically. She could practically see him thinking, remarking that he seemed to be having difficulty coming up with an answer. Ryan considered pretending to know nothing, but he doubted someone like Mentil would let the matter rest so easily. He desperately tried to recall how the original seventh prince might have reacted in this situation. To his surprise, Mentil suddenly withdrew her hand, ending her attempt to read his mind. Turning her back on him, she calmly announced that if he refused to speak, she would simply use another method. Before Ryan could ask what she meant, Mentil summoned the knights standing outside her chambers. The two men quickly entered and respectfully bowed. With an irritated sigh, Mentil explained that her younger brother was refusing to cooperate and casually ordered the knights to slit Ryan's mouth open if necessary. The command horrified both men. They immediately protested, insisting that they could never carry out such a cruel order against a prince of the imperial family. The knights even fell to his knees and begged her to reconsider. Ryan, meanwhile, watched the scene unfold while trying his best to remain calm despite the cold sweat running down his back. Mentil, however, had already lost patience. Complaining that the noise was irritating, she activated her human Manus. Her eyes glowed faintly as her mind control ability took effect. In an instant, the knight's resistance disappeared. Under her control, both men silently unsheathed their swords and pointed them directly at Ryan. Although panic surged inside him, Ryan forced himself to remain composed. Mentil then warned him to choose his next words carefully, implying that his fate depended entirely on his answer. Before she could continue, Ryan abruptly spoke. He quietly stated that his mother had passed away. The unexpected answer immediately caught Mentil off guard. Her expression shifted as she turned toward him and demanded an explanation. She questioned how he could possibly know such a thing, and whether he had somehow remained in contact with his mother all this time. Ryan calmly explained that before leaving, his mother had entrusted him with a necklace containing a beautiful blue gemstone. According to her, as long as the gem continued to shine, they would meet again someday. However, not long ago, the blue light had gradually faded before the gemstone suddenly turned black and shattered. At that moment, Ryan claimed, he realized that his mother, who had always longed to return home, had finally found peace in her homeland in the east. Hearing his story, Mentil's entire demeanor changed. The dangerous aura surrounding her faded, replaced by a rare softness that made her seem almost gentle. Observing her reaction, Ryan could only think to himself that everything he had just said was a complete fabrication. Still, he knew the lie was believable. Among all of the Emperor's consorts, Ryan's mother had been the only one to successfully escape the imperial family. The true reason behind her disappearance had never been revealed in the novel, though many believed she had returned to her homeland in the east. Some even speculated that she had fled because she had given birth to a black-haired prince. Whatever the truth was, one thing remained certain: she never appeared again, not even until the very end of the story. Mentil slowly approached Ryan after hearing his explanation. She admitted that she had always assumed he resented his biological mother for abandoning him. Ryan, however, replied that he was not entirely sure how he felt. When he was younger, he had certainly hated her for leaving him behind, but as time passed, he had found himself gazing toward the eastern sky night after night, while absent-mindedly holding onto the necklace she had left him. Taking the necklace out and placing it on the table, Ryan quietly suggested that perhaps he had simply missed her all along. Hearing this, Mentil asked whether those feelings had changed the way he viewed the rest of his blood relatives. Ryan reflected on how strange it was that years of resentment could transform into longing in a single instant. Perhaps, he said, that was simply what family meant. For a moment, Mentil remained silent as she carefully studied him. Then, without another word, she ordered the knights to sheath their swords and wait outside. Still under the effects of her mind control ability, the knights obeyed immediately. Before dismissing them, Mentil commanded them to erase everything that had happened in the room from their memories. Once they had left, Ryan silently wondered whether his lie had truly worked. His answer came quickly. Mentil approached him and gently held his hands, telling him that he must have suffered greatly all this time. At that moment, Ryan knew he had succeeded. However, her next words immediately irritated him. Mentil reminded him that even if he was the black-haired failure, he was still her younger brother. Ryan could not help wondering whether she genuinely cared about him or was simply toying with him. Considering that Mentil possessed the power to control nearly anyone at will, it was only natural for her to become suspicious when that absolute power suddenly failed. Besides, the original seventh prince had never been particularly close to her in the first place. Regardless, Ryan's deception had successfully diffused the situation. Ironically, the necklace that had moved Mentil so deeply was nothing more than a cheap accessory Ryan had found lying around. His thoughts then drifted toward Duke Fetus. According to the original story, the Duke was supposed to fall into the valley and lose his legs. Ryan wondered whether the Duke had already encountered the protagonist or if something had gone wrong. Surely, someone as important as Duke Fetus could not have died so easily. Meanwhile, deep inside a cave near the waterfall, Duke Fetus groaned in pain while clutching his broken right leg. The mysterious boy standing before him calmly warned him not to move recklessly, explaining that his leg was badly fractured. Realizing he was unarmed and severely injured, the Duke quickly assessed his situation. In his current condition, escape was impossible. Even in the dim cave, he could tell that the boy was extraordinarily skilled. His stance was flawless, and the sword pointed at him carried an overwhelming sharpness. One glance was enough to understand that this was no ordinary child. As the sword edged closer, the Duke hurriedly asked the boy to lower his weapon and explain what was happening. The boy eventually withdrew the blade and revealed that a few days earlier he had seen a massive sphere of water flying across the sky. He had tried to pursue it, but it had been moving far too quickly. Judging by the speed at which it crashed into the ground, he had assumed that whoever was inside must have been killed instantly. Hearing this, the Duke immediately realized that the boy was referring to his execution by the first princess. Confused, the Duke wondered how he had managed to survive at all. He then remembered the stone bag he had been carrying and suspected it might have protected him somehow, although it was nowhere to be found now. It had likely been lost during the fall. The boy soon raised his sword once again. He explained that while searching the area, he had discovered an old man covered in blood inside a nearby cave. In the next instant, he thrust his sword into the wall right beside the Duke's face. With an icy stare, he asked in the name of God Amika whether the Duke was loyal to the Aberrant Empire. The moment he heard that name, Duke Fetus understood exactly who he was dealing with. Of all people to encounter in his current state, it had to be a heretic. Memories suddenly flooded his mind, dead children discarded like trash, starving vagrants abandoned by the Empire, and Ryan's harsh criticism about imperial dogs who blindly served their masters without question. He also remembered his beloved son, Flynn, whom he had always hoped would inherit his ideals, and one day become the sword of the imperial family, eradicating all heretics in the Empire's name. Returning to the present, Duke Freitas slowly closed his eyes and let out a weary sigh. When he opened them again, they burned with an unfamiliar anger. He declared that he knew nothing about loyalty to the Aberran Empire. He claimed that he was merely a senile old man who had lost his footing while wandering carelessly through the mountains. Before long, Duke Freitas had recovered enough to walk on his own, though his left ankle remained tied with a rope. Letting out a helpless sigh, he thanked Rattel for treating his injured leg before politely asking him to untie the rope. He explained that walking while dragging it was difficult, and, at his age, even a simple fall could have serious consequences. If he injured himself again, Rattel would only have to drag him along anyway. However, Rattel answered with a cold and immediate refusal. The Duke tried to reason with him once more, but the boy merely glanced back for a brief moment before continuing forward. Without another word, he gave the rope a sharp tug, nearly pulling Duke Freitas off his feet. The Duke barely managed to keep his balance, and quickly realized that Rattel had no intention of listening to anything he said. As they continued deeper into the cave, Duke Freitas quietly observed his surroundings. He found it hard to believe that such a massive cave existed so close to the Imperial Forest, without anyone discovering it. Earlier, Rattel had mentioned the name Amika, the deity worshipped by the heretics who were believed to have been completely wiped out over 50 years ago. Could they have truly been hiding here all this time? The Duke began retracing his memories from before he lost consciousness. He believed he had been thrown somewhere west of the forest's central tower, or perhaps southwest. If he ever escaped, he could determine the cave's exact location and return later with reinforcements. His thoughts came to an abrupt halt as he realized how ridiculous they sounded. After everything that had happened, he was still thinking like the commander of the Imperial Knights. With a bitter sigh, he questioned why someone branded as a traitor was still so devoted to the Empire. After walking in silence for a while, Rattel suddenly asked the old man's name. The Duke introduced himself as Agony Freitas. Hearing the answer, Rattel rested one hand against the cave wall and admitted that he had been genuinely surprised when he first found him. According to him, this cave was protected by a divine blessing. It was not a place that outsiders could enter through their own will, especially someone from the Aberran Empire. As he finished speaking, Rattel drove his sword into the stone wall. Instantly, countless glowing golden symbols spread across the rock, flowing from the wall into the blade like streams of light. Duke Freitas watched the unbelievable sight in stunned silence as the wall trembled before slowly splitting apart. As the brilliant light faded, the hidden space beyond the wall finally came into view. An enormous and magnificent palace stood before them, completely concealed within the mountain. Seeing the Duke's astonishment, Rattel calmly explained that there were only two possible reasons why he had been able to enter this sacred place. Either he was an agent of the Aberran Empire sent to exterminate them, or he had been guided there by the will of God, Amika herself. Regardless of which was true, Rattel welcomed Agony Freitas to the domain of Amika. The scene then shifted to Raja, who was once again undergoing his treatment. Meanwhile, Ryan lounged casually on a nearby sofa, quietly organizing his thoughts. Since the timeline had already begun accelerating, he figured it would be better if Duke Freitas and the story's protagonist also started moving sooner than expected. With a bit of luck, news about the protagonist might reach him before long. Ryan even felt a slight sense of guilt for dragging Duke Freitas into unnecessary suffering, but his thoughts were abruptly interrupted when Razia slammed his hand onto the table in frustration. Complaining that today's medicine was too little, Razia demanded a larger amount so he could recover faster. Ryan looked at him coldly and calmly asked whether he had just shouted at him. Razia immediately denied it, claiming he was simply frustrated with how long the treatment was taking. Ryan reminded him once again that rushing the process would only destroy his body and advised him to be patient. However, Rasha refused to give up and asked whether there was a faster, even riskier method than the hookah. Ryan looked at him in confusion before asking what he meant. Rasha reminded him that the very first time Ryan barged into his room, he had told him to quit the hookah if he was truly worried about his health. Ryan simply smiled and replied that quitting it would only benefit him anyway. Annoyed by the response, Rasha cursed under his breath and stormed away. Watching him leave, Ryan silently reflected on how badly Raja's lifestyle was destroying him. The hookah, the wine sitting on the nearby table, even the food he consumed every day, all of it acted like poison because of the mysterious seed growing inside his body. Unless that seed was removed, Rasia would remain dependent on Ryan's treatment for the rest of his life. Putting those thoughts aside, Ryan announced that the treatment should end for the day since they still had to attend the evening ritual. During the ceremony, Rasha placed his hand on the ceremonial platform, and everyone immediately noticed that his mana had increased significantly compared to before. The other princes openly praised his remarkable improvement, while their father concluded the ceremony after seeing no further challengers step forward. As the princes gradually left the hall, Ryan deliberately remained seated. He preferred leaving last, avoiding unnecessary attention from the other members of the imperial family. Just then, the 8th prince, Selos, marched over, grabbed Ryan by the head, and mockingly called him a blackbird. He questioned why Ryan was still sitting there when the ritual had already ended before taunting him about the mother who had supposedly abandoned him during his childhood. Ryan silently endured the insults, thinking that sooner or later he would have to teach the ill-mannered prince a lesson. Before the situation could escalate any further, Mentil suddenly appeared behind them. Mentil calmly addressed Ryan, mentioning that he had looked unusually gloomy throughout the ritual. Selos immediately froze, mistakenly believing the first princess was speaking to him. Ryan, however, respectfully greeted Mentil as she approached. She asked whether he was feeling unwell, but Ryan casually replied that he was perfectly fine and merely found the rituals rather dull. Without acknowledging Selos's presence even once, Mentil gently reminded Ryan that, entertaining or not, the imperial ritual carried great significance, and that he should avoid making his boredom so obvious. After offering a brief farewell, she quietly departed. Selos stood there in complete disbelief as the first princess walked away, stunned that she had ignored him entirely while speaking only to Ryan. The moment Mentil disappeared from sight, Selos grabbed Ryan by the collar and demanded to know why someone like the first princess would show concern for him. Ryan simply sighed to himself, feeling that his life was becoming increasingly troublesome with each passing day. Before Selos could continue, another hand landed firmly on his shoulder. He turned around in alarm, only to find Rasha standing behind him. Looking at Selos with a calm but intimidating expression, Rasha asked whether he had some kind of problem with Ryan. It was the second time that day Selos had been left utterly terrified. Still being held by the collar, Ryan remained completely unfazed. Calmly, he told Rasha that it was nothing more than a brief exchange between younger brothers. Without showing the slightest concern for Selos, Ryan straightened his clothes and politely excused himself, remarking that Rasha was probably busy as well. With that, he quietly walked away. Rasha also left the hall alongside the second prince, Dido, while Selos remained frozen in place, unable to process everything that had just happened. As the two princes walked through the palace corridors, Dido brought up an interesting piece of news. He mentioned that Tolan, the former disciple of Duke Fetus, seemed to be plotting something within the central territory that had been assigned to the Fetus family. Razia showed little interest, dismissing Tolan and his followers as insignificant insects. In his eyes, the Fetus family had only 1 year left before their territory legally returned to the imperial family, making any resistance meaningless. However, Dido smiled mischievously and revealed that there was no reason to wait an entire year. His words finally caught Rashia's attention. Wearing a cruel smile, Dido claimed he already had the perfect plan and asked whether Rasha wanted to hear it. Meanwhile, Selos finally snapped out of his daze. He pinned Ryan against a nearby wall, demanding to know what he really was. Ryan simply looked back at him with a calm expression before sarcastically introducing himself as the seventh prince, Ryan Abiran. Frustrated by the response, Selos ignited a small flame in his hand and demanded the truth. Unable to understand why both the first prince and the first princess had shown interest in someone they normally ignored, he threatened to burn Ryan to ashes unless he confessed everything. Ryan, however, wasn't intimidated in the slightest. Instead, he casually pointed out that the tiny amount of monies Selos had gathered was barely enough to light an oil lamp, let alone burn someone alive. If Selos actually tried, Ryan remarked, it would take so long that someone else would surely discover them first. The blunt observation immediately shook Selos, causing him to instinctively lower the flame. In a trembling voice, he demanded to know how Ryan had figured it out. Ryan took a step closer and, with a calm but commanding tone, told him that if he truly wanted to keep his weakness a secret, the first thing he should do was stop speaking so disrespectfully to his older brother. Back at the Fetus estate, Tolan's orders were being carried out without mercy. Anyone caught speaking against his commands had their tongues cut out, while every possession and record connected to Agony Fetus was ordered to be burned. Tolan declared that there would be no funeral, no memorial, and nothing left behind that could remind anyone of the former duke. He also warned the entire household that anyone who disobeyed these orders would face severe punishment. Not long afterward, the commander of the Fetus Knights, Jack, arrived to report on the situation. He informed Tolan that, just as ordered, they had captured those spreading false rumors throughout the Second Night Order. Their punishment had already been carried out. Their wrists were cut off before they were expelled. As Jack finished his report, he let out a tired yawn. Tolan noticed immediately and asked whether he was exhausted. Jack apologized, explaining that the family was severely short-handed, forcing everyone to work through the night. Tolan acknowledged his efforts before accepting the list of deserters Jack had prepared. Jack explained that security had been tightened to stop anyone else from fleeing, but despite their efforts, nearly half of their manpower had already deserted. As Tolan read through the list, he realized that even the noble families who had faithfully served the Fetus household for generations had begun cutting ties with them. It became painfully obvious that if discipline within the estate also collapsed, the Fetus family would truly be finished. Jack hesitated before voicing another concern. He admitted that erasing every trace of Agony Fetus felt far too extreme, and feared that such actions would only anger those who still remained loyal to the former duke. Tolan's expression instantly turned cold. In a frightening voice, he asked Jack whether he still believed Agony was the head of the Fetus family. Startled, Jack immediately apologized, explaining that he simply found it impossible to believe that someone as honorable and loyal as Agony could have met such a disgraceful end. As he looked at Talon, Jack couldn't help noticing how different he had become. The cheerful young man he once knew had disappeared, replaced by someone cold and unwavering, making Jack wonder if this transformation had been caused by the pain of feeling betrayed by Agony himself. After dismissing Jack, Talon gathered every soldier, servant, and resident of the Fetus territory before a large podium. The atmosphere was filled with fear and uncertainty. Rumors had already spread that those who questioned Talon had their tongues cut out, and some soldiers had even considered fleeing. However, the thought of being captured terrified them even more. Once everyone had assembled, Talon began speaking. He reminded them that the House of Fetus had faithfully served Sierra the Great ever since its foundation, and had stood beside the imperial family as its closest guardian for over 1,000 years. However, everything they had built throughout those centuries had been thrown into chaos because Agony Fetus had been branded a traitor and executed by the imperial family. Hearing Talon calmly call the former duke a traitor left the entire crowd stunned. He continued by acknowledging that many people now doubted the loyalty of the Fetus family. Because of that, he announced that anyone wishing to leave was free to do so that very day, even if their contracts had not yet expired. However, he also declared that the House of Fetus still possessed an heir. Until Flynn was old enough to inherit the title of Duke, Talon himself would continue protecting the family's 1,000-year oath and proving their loyalty to both the Empire and the imperial family. He ended his speech with a stern warning that anyone who abandoned their loyalty to the house would be punished without mercy. Talon's unwavering determination left everyone speechless. Even Jack, despite believing his methods were harsh, understood that Talon was making the only choices capable of saving the family. As long as Flynn remained alive, the Fetus household still had a future, and rebuilding the family's reputation as quickly as possible was the only path forward. Deep down, however, Jack couldn't help missing the old Talon, the young man who used to become flustered whenever the servants teased him. After the gathering ended, Talon asked his aide, Pale, whether the temple had accepted their request. Pale reluctantly informed him that the temple had already refused, declaring they would never again receive anyone from the House of Fetus. Talon showed no surprise. Instead, he calmly removed a sealed letter from inside his jacket and handed it to Pale, instructing him to include it with their next request. He confidently stated that once the temple read its contents, they would not regret opening it. Left alone with his thoughts, Talon admitted to himself that he still could not understand why Agony Fetus had chosen to rebel against the Iberan Empire when he knew it could only end in death. He wondered whether the drifters living near the temple truly meant that much to Agony. Although he still lacked the full truth, Talon silently vowed that Agony's sacrifice would never be meaningless. Looking toward the skies, he prayed that his former master would watch over the land he had entrusted to him until the House of Fetus rose to greatness once again. Later, Talon finally received permission to visit the temple. As he arrived, he couldn't help being overwhelmed by the sheer magnificence of the sacred place. Its towering architecture and peaceful atmosphere were unlike anything he had ever seen. However, he had not come to admire its beauty. Talon stepped inside with a clear objective in mind to prevent whatever scheme Raja was planning before it was too late. Meanwhile, Rasha and Dito had also learned about the speech Talon had delivered to the people of the Fetus territory. While many saw it as the determination of someone trying to save his family, Razia couldn't have cared less. He had no interest in Tolan's resolve or the loyalty of the Fetus household. The only thing occupying his mind was finding the fastest way to completely erase the Fetus family from existence. At the same time, Ryan headed back into the Imperial Forest. Now that he had already figured out the conditions for transforming into smaller creatures like rodents and foxes, he decided it was time to add larger animals to his collection. Despite repeatedly trying to leave it behind, the stubborn squirrel refused to stop following him. No matter how many times Ryan tried to shake it off, the tiny creature always managed to catch up. Eventually, he gave up, picked the squirrel up, and tucked it safely inside his bag so it wouldn't get caught in the middle of any dangerous situation. Watching the squirrel stubbornly cling to him, Ryan couldn't help wondering whether it had also transmigrated into the novel just like he had. After searching the forest for some time, Ryan finally found the creature he had been looking for. He immediately stopped in his tracks as a massive wolf slowly emerged from the dense bushes ahead. The beast's enormous frame and intimidating presence made it clear that this would be nothing like dealing with ordinary forest animals. Even so, Ryan cautiously tried to approach it without provoking a fight. His only goal was to briefly touch the back of its neck so he could fulfill the condition for his transformation ability before quietly leaving. Unfortunately, judging from the wolf's piercing gaze and threatening posture, it was obvious that things were not going to be nearly that simple. Moments later, the Imperial Forest was filled with the sound of pounding footsteps as Ryan sprinted through the trees with a giant wolf charging right behind him. The furious beast roared as it rapidly closed the distance. Clutching the squirrel in one hand, Ryan angrily demanded to know why it had done something so reckless. The squirrel simply answered with an innocent squeak, showing no sign of regret. Just moments earlier, Everything had actually been going according to plan. The giant wolf had turned out to be surprisingly calm, and Ryan had only needed to touch the back of its neck before quietly leaving. But at the exact moment he reached out, the stubborn squirrel suddenly leaped out of his bag and bit the wolf, instantly turning a peaceful encounter into a life-or-death chase. Now, while desperately running for his life, Ryan couldn't stop yelling at the tiny troublemaker. If the squirrel wanted to die so badly, it should have done it alone instead of dragging him into the mess. The squirrel merely stared back with an annoyingly cold expression, as if Ryan was the one overreacting. Meanwhile, the wolf showed no intention of giving up the pursuit. Ryan quickly realized the beast would catch him sooner or later. His mind raced as he considered which animal he should transform into. Any land animal would still be slower than the giant wolf, while turning into a crow would take too much time before he could gain enough altitude to escape. Desperation forced Ryan to think differently. If only he could run and fly at the same time. If only he could combine both abilities instead of choosing one. The thought flashed through his mind, and in that instant, an unfamiliar sensation spread throughout his body. Even the squirrel seemed to notice something changing, and instinctively tightened its grip on him. Behind them, the giant wolf suddenly slowed down before lifting its head in confusion. Its prey had vanished from the ground and flew away. High above the forest, Ryan looked down in disbelief while the squirrel desperately clung to his fur. They had escaped. Relieved, Ryan examined his new body, only to freeze in shock. He hadn't transformed into a crow or any flying creature. Instead, he had become the very same giant wolf that had been chasing him, but this version possessed a massive pair of wings. At that moment, Ryan finally understood the true potential of his ability. His transformations weren't limited to copying existing animals. He could customize them, combining different traits to create entirely new forms. Outside the temple, the gathered crowd whispered among themselves as they watched the commotion unfold. Many had already heard that the entire area would soon come under the control of the Fetus family. Others talked about Agony Fetus, wondering why he would throw away his life by rebelling against the royal family just to obtain this land. Some believed he had simply gone mad, while others claimed the current acting head, Talon, wasn't much different. A few even joked that there had to be buried treasure hidden somewhere nearby. Otherwise, none of it made sense. Hidden among the crowd were two young pickpockets. One excitedly told the other that this was the perfect opportunity to empty a few unsuspecting pockets. Meanwhile, a hooded man silently observed everything from the back of the crowd, wondering what exactly Talon was trying to accomplish now that the Fetus family was already walking toward ruin. Standing before everyone, Talon calmly raised 2 fingers into the air before making a shocking announcement. Every vagrant still occupying the area would be given exactly 2 months to leave. Anyone who remained afterward would be punished for defiling the sacred grounds surrounding the holy temple. Panic immediately spread through the crowd. Many desperately asked where they were supposed to go, arguing that forcing them out was no different from sentencing them to death. Even the 2 young thieves paused in confusion, though one quickly urged the other to stop worrying and run before anyone noticed them. Some spectators sighed in disappointment, admitting they had expected the soft-hearted acting head of the Fetus family to show compassion. Others concluded that Tolan was simply trying to repair the family's reputation in the eyes of the royal family. At that moment, the hooded man finally spoke up and asked what Tolan intended to build after clearing the land. Without hesitation, Tolan answered that the Fetus family would construct a hospital. Not only that, they would also establish a place where ordinary people could study medical arts and become healers themselves. The announcement was immediately met with laughter. The nobles present mocked the idea, arguing that medicine was something only noble families had the right to study and teach. They ridiculed the thought that anyone would willingly learn from the disgraced Fetus family, claiming the project would only drag them even deeper into ruin. Even the hooded man quietly concluded that the chances of success were virtually non-existent. Just as he decided he had overestimated Talon, a powerful voice suddenly echoed across the plaza, demanding to know who dared laugh at such a man. Everyone turned toward the arriving carriage as an elderly man stepped out with an imposing presence. Introducing himself as High Priest Vesper, he publicly declared that he personally vouched for Tolan Krista, the acting head of the House of Fetus, in the name of God. The crowd instantly recognized the High Priest and immediately fell to their knees. Walking up to Tolan, Vesper warmly greeted him before addressing the crowd. He described all people of Abiran as travelers walking the same road through temptation and evil. Although the Fetus family had been stained by the sins of one man, he proclaimed that another still chose to walk the righteous path. Pointing directly at Tolan, he prayed that this child of Abiran would complete his journey of atonement under God's blessing. Tolan respectfully thanked the high priest, while Vesper praised the hospital project and invited him to ride together into the temple to pay their respects to Sierra the Great. Outwardly, Tolan accepted with gratitude. Inwardly, however, he couldn't help cursing. He knew perfectly well that the high priest had only appeared because the Fetus family had agreed to the temple's outrageous conditions. Although the family would bear every construction cost, the temple had demanded half of all future profits from both the hospital and the medical academy. Even so, Tolan had no regrets. Winning the high priest's public support was worth the price. As the carriage departed, Tolan suddenly called out to the hooded spectator, addressing him as young Master Milio. The hooded man froze in shock, wondering when Tolan had discovered his identity. Looking at him coldly, Tolan remarked that the world was not so easily overturned. Elsewhere, Razia was furious after witnessing the entire spectacle. He angrily cursed the high priest for interfering, but Dito calmly explained that Talon had simply outplayed them. Once the high priest publicly supported the fetus family, the nobles would have little choice but to follow. Razia clenched his teeth, furious that someone he considered an insignificant insect had used the temple as a stepping stone. Dito assured him there was no reason for the future emperor of Abiran to worry, and reminded him that he already had a solution. Rasha dismissed him, saying he would hear the plan later because he was too angry and needed to kill someone to calm himself. After Raja stormed out, Dito quietly smiled into his wine glass before asking his attendant to confirm whether the acting head of the fetus family was indeed Talon Krista, the third son of Count Krista's house, who had served Agony Fetus for 13 years. Receiving confirmation, Dito casually smashed his wine glass against the attendant's head without warning. As the attendant apologized, Dito mocked him for not even screaming, admitting that his emotionless behavior was exactly why he kept him around. Sitting back down, Dito lazily issued another order. He instructed the attendant to investigate the past 5 years of Count Krista's tax records. If any irregularity was discovered, the Count was to be arrested immediately. If nothing could be found, evidence should simply be fabricated before making the arrest anyway. As the attendant calmly accepted the order and left the room, Dito gazed out the window and sighed. The bright sunny weather irritated him almost as much as the condition of Raja. Watching the first prince's body rapidly deteriorate had been entertaining, but seeing him recover again was equally annoying. The scene then shifted back to the fetus estate, where Pale arrived carrying a stack of documents for Talon. He reported that every preparation for the hospital's construction had finally been completed. On top of that, applications from noble families wishing to study and teach medicine had already exceeded the available capacity. Talon simply nodded in satisfaction, but Pale quickly brought up another issue. Although the project was progressing smoothly, many vagrants still refused to leave the central district, and the 2-month deadline was almost over. He asked whether the Knight Commander should begin preparing the troops to remove them by force. Without even looking up from the documents, Tolan answered in a cold voice that there was no need to involve Jack. He already had another plan in mind. Pale immediately acknowledged the order before mentioning that another letter had arrived, this time from House Krista. As Tolan accepted the envelope, he couldn't help wondering why his birth family had decided to contact him first after all this time. Opening the letter, he was surprised to discover that it had been sent by his elder brother, Igo Krista, who intended to personally visit the fetus estate. 2 weeks later, the long-awaited meeting finally took place. Sitting across from Tolan, Igo Krista, the eldest son of House Krista, delivered unsettling news. The previous night, Count Krista had been placed under house arrest following a tax audit ordered directly by the imperial family. According to the investigation, several financial irregularities had been uncovered, and if the accusations were proven true, their father could even end up imprisoned inside the imperial prison. Tolan immediately questioned whether Igo truly believed their father was capable of committing such crimes. However, Igo calmly replied that regardless of the truth, one fact remained unchanged. The Krista family was now facing a crisis. Tolan firmly defended his father, insisting that Count Krista had never been a man driven by greed or ambition. He had always lived a quiet and disciplined life, making the accusations difficult to believe. Igo then looked directly into Tolan's eyes before asking a heavy question. Was Tolan saying that because he genuinely knew nothing, or because he refused to admit the truth? Anger immediately surfaced on Tolan's face as he demanded to know whether his brother wanted him to admit that he was the reason their entire family had fallen into disaster. Instead of continuing that argument, Igo calmly placed his teacup on the table and changed the subject. He mentioned hearing an interesting rumor about Tolan's recent actions. Apparently, the fetus estate had begun employing the homeless people from the central district as laborers for the hospital's construction, providing them with food and shelter in exchange for their work. Tolan explained that the construction site desperately needed workers, and reducing the number of vagrants would naturally improve public order throughout the central district. However, Igo continued by mentioning another rumor that Tolan had also been distributing free meals to orphan children. He made it clear that he had no interest in whether the fetus family wanted to become a charity or a refuge for the poor. What truly concerned him was something far more dangerous. According to the information he had received, the first prince wanted every single vagrant in the central district wiped out. The moment Tolan heard those words, his expression instantly darkened. Shock quickly turned into fury. Rising from his seat, he declared that if his brother had only come to waste his time with meaningless conversation, then the meeting was over. He reminded Igo that he now belonged to the fetus family, not the Krista household. Even as Tolan prepared to leave, Igo called out one last time, asking him to think carefully because Count Krista was still their father. Tolan stopped for only a brief moment before clenching his fists in anger. Without looking back, he coldly reminded his brother that their father had already cast him aside 13 years ago. As far as Tolan was concerned, That relationship had ended long ago. The scene then shifted to Mentilla Biren, who was restlessly wandering through the underground sanctuary while grumbling to herself. She had grown completely fed up with the endless preparations for the Tennis ritual. Although she understood how important the ceremony was, she couldn't stand being locked away beneath the palace any longer. Spending every day surrounded by nothing but attendants and servants was slowly driving her insane. Just as she continued complaining, someone suddenly appeared in front of her, causing both of them to stop in surprise. The newcomer was none other than the Empress herself. She looked genuinely startled to find Mentil wandering outside the prayer hall. Mentil, however, greeted her with a playful smile, asking whether Her Majesty had come all the way down just to see her. The Empress ignored the joke and instead asked whether Mentil was planning to leave the sanctuary. She reminded her that the preparations for the Tennis ritual were still underway inside the prayer chamber, and that she should already be there. Mentil teasingly remarked that her mother seemed unusually worried about her today. The Empress quietly replied that she couldn't help worrying because Mentil was the daughter she had carried in her womb. Every single day she feared that something terrible might happen, or that Mentil would make a mistake. Not a day passed without that concern weighing on her mind. Hearing such affectionate words was so unusual that even Mentil found herself caught off guard. She suggested that perhaps they could enjoy tea together beneath the open sky like they used to long ago. However, the Empress simply turned her back without accepting the invitation. She calmly stated that seeing Mentil's face was enough for today, because she had an important meeting with His Majesty the Emperor. Advising Mentil to return to her duties immediately, she walked away without another word. Watching her disappear down the corridor, Mentil quietly frowned. With the Tennis ritual only days away, the Emperor was supposed to remain inside the palace at all times. That made her mother's excuse feel strangely suspicious. She couldn't decide whether it had simply been an insincere lie or whether something truly urgent had happened. For a brief moment, she even found herself wishing that her ability actually worked on her own mother. As Mentil prepared to head back, something suddenly caught her attention. She stopped in her tracks and slowly looked toward the side passage where the Empress had appeared only moments earlier. Unlike the main hallway, this was a narrow pathway that seemed almost hidden from view. Meanwhile, back in the forest, Ryan's first attempt at flying ended in complete disaster. Unable to properly control his newly created form, he crashed straight through several trees before slamming onto the forest floor. The squirrel managed to grab onto a nearby branch just in time, while Ryan lay bruised and battered on the ground. After catching his breath, he sighed in relief, grateful that he was still alive. As he replayed everything that had happened, he realized his ability was becoming stranger the more he understood it. Not only could he transform into different animals, but he could also freely combine the traits of multiple species to create entirely new forms. The potential of this power was far greater than he had ever imagined. Still, an ability this incredible couldn't possibly come without a price. Panting heavily, Ryan wondered whether overusing it shortened his lifespan or carried some other hidden drawback. Before he could think any further, Ryan noticed something was wrong with his body, and the next moment he collapsed unconscious onto the ground. Seeing this, the squirrel immediately rushed over and anxiously tried to wake him. When Ryan didn't respond, the tiny creature became frustrated and smacked him hard on the head with its fluffy tail, leaving a noticeable bump. Even after that, Ryan remained completely motionless. Folding its tiny arms, the squirrel stared down at him with a puzzled expression. Then, something completely unexpected happened. The squirrel suddenly spoke in a clear voice, asking whether Ryan had truly lost consciousness before sighing that he was unbelievably weak. At that very moment, the giant wolf that had been chasing them quietly emerged from the bushes, carefully watching the strange scene unfold. As the wolf prepared to charge forward, the squirrel didn't flee. Instead, it casually smacked the wolf across the face with its tail and told it to be quiet because Ryan was trying to sleep. The enormous wolf immediately froze before letting out a frightened whimper. The squirrel then mockingly asked whether it was still upset about getting bitten earlier, dismissing the whole incident as nothing more than harmless play after such a long time. The embarrassed wolf softly whimpered again before asking about Ryan. The squirrel chuckled in response. In the next instant, the squirrel's body was engulfed in a brilliant golden light. The giant wolf instinctively stepped back, trembling as an overwhelming presence filled the forest. Ryan remained unconscious on the ground, completely unaware of what was happening beside him. As the golden light grew brighter, the squirrel revealed its true form, a mysterious, radiant being unlike any ordinary creature. Looking directly at the wolf, the golden entity reminded it that it had witnessed everything with its own eyes. Ryan was the very human they had all been waiting for. Hearing those words, the giant wolf lifted its head and released a powerful howl that echoed throughout the entire imperial forest. Birds took flight, deer stopped in their tracks, and countless beasts turned toward the sound. Watching them all respond, the golden entity calmly issued its command. When the time was right, every animal in the forest was to spread the news that the long-awaited human had finally arrived. Ryan was still weak and needed time to recover, but before long, the one they had all been waiting for would finally awaken.